It was late September when I moved into a small town on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio. I had accepted a temporary position at a local university and wanted a quiet place where I could focus on my writing while teaching a few courses. I found a rental house, a modest two-story structure built in 1928, with weathered brick siding and a narrow porch that wrapped around the front. The realtor had warned me it had been vacant for nearly a year, but she insisted it was safe and structurally sound. I was too tired from the drive to care. I needed a place to settle immediately. The first night, I noticed how still the house was. Not the peaceful stillness I had expected, but a heavy, almost pressing quiet that seemed to settle in corners and stretch across the floors. The wind rattled the windows intermittently, and the floorboards groaned under even my lightest steps. I tried to relax, telling myself that old houses had quirks, and that my imagination was probably working overtime after the long drive. But sleep was uneasy. Every creak or rustle startled me awake. Within days, subtle disturbances began. A book I had left on the living room table would appear on the kitchen counter. My coffee cup, placed carefully on the windowsill, would be moved to the edge of the sink. At first, I blamed my own forgetfulness, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. Then came the footsteps. Faint at first, they seemed to pace the hallway above my bedroom. My heart would race as I climbed the narrow stairs, flashlight in hand, only to find the rooms empty. No signs of forced entry, nothing broken, just evidence of a presence. One night, around midnight, I awoke to a soft whisper. It was so faint I almost thought it was my imagination, but then I distinctly heard my name. Emily. My heart stopped. I sat up in bed, trying to calm my shaking hands. The room was empty, yet I could feel a presence, deliberate and patient. I called out, "Who's there?" But the only response was silence. Over the next weeks, the activity intensified. Doors I had closed would be ajar when I returned. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision. Objects moved subtly but intentionally. A pen shifted an inch on the desk, a chair rotated slightly, a newspaper folded differently. There was no chaos, no aggression, only a quiet insistence that the house was not empty. I began keeping a journal, meticulously noting every occurrence, footsteps, whispers, object movements, flickering lights. During a particularly fierce storm in early October, the presence became almost tangible. Rain lashed against the windows, wind rattled the eaves, and I was at my desk writing when the air suddenly chilled. The chair across the room shifted as though someone had just risen and sat down again. I heard soft, measured breathing nearby. Trembling, I whispered, "I see you. I know you're here." And the breathing stopped, leaving only the storm outside. It was the first time I sensed not threat, but observation. Curious and desperate for answers, I began researching the house's history. Built in 1928, it had served as a private residence for decades. Several occupants had died there, mostly from natural causes. One woman, Margaret Hale, had lived in the house during the 1940s and passed away alone in the upstairs bedroom. Locals whispered that she lingered, bound to the house by loneliness or unfinished business. There were no official reports of hauntings, but I found enough mentions in old newspapers and town records to consider that perhaps I was not imagining things. By mid-October, I started leaving notes around the house. Simple questions like, "Are you okay?" or "Do you want me to leave?" Sometimes the notes remained untouched. Other times they were moved or folded differently. One morning, a note appeared on my desk with a single word written in delicate script: lonely. My heart pounded. The interaction was undeniable. Dreams followed. Every night I dreamed from Margaret's perspective, moving silently through the rooms, observing, lingering. Sometimes she would stand at the window, staring at the trees beyond the porch, radiating profound sadness. I woke with a lingering ache and the sense of being watched. Occasionally I would feel a faint brush against my shoulder, soft and fleeting, as if to remind me she was present. By late October, the presence became part of the house's rhythm. I spoke to it at night, left candles, small cups of tea, or notes saying, "You are seen. You are acknowledged." The footsteps, whispers, and subtle object movements became a quiet dialogue. I no longer felt fear, but a strange companionship, a bond unspoken yet unmistakable. One particularly cold night, sitting by the fireplace, the air shifted behind me. A soft whisper said, "Stay." My breath caught, and I responded, "You're safe. I acknowledge you." The room seemed to exhale. The rocking chair in the corner shifted gently once, then stopped. It felt like a farewell. Margaret had finally found peace. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances diminished. Footsteps slowed, whispers faded, objects stayed where I placed them. The house returned to near normal quiet, yet the memory of her presence lingered. I realized that not all spirits linger to frighten. Some remain because of unresolved grief or the need to be recognized. Fear can be replaced by understanding, acknowledgement, and respect, creating connection even across life and death. Even after I moved months later, the memory stayed. On quiet nights when the wind rattles a window or a floorboard creaks, I still remember her presence. Not frightening, not hostile, but profound. Margaret Hale's ghost became a reminder that the living and the departed can share space, communicate, and find peace through recognition. Some spirits need to be acknowledged, not to harm, leaving traces that are gentle but impossible to forget. Story the end. It started with the house. Not in a way that you'd expect, though. No ominous history, no stories of old deaths or unexplained tragedies. It was just a quiet, modest home on the outskirts of a small town in Virginia, the kind of place you'd barely notice if you were driving past. Single story, pale yellow siding, a porch that creaked under your weight but didn't look it was about to collapse. I'd been looking for somewhere peaceful after a long, exhausting few years in the city. I didn't think of myself as someone who believed in ghosts. Not really, but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't devoured a few late-night paranormal documentaries with the lights off, daring myself not to flinch when something flickered on the screen. None of it ever felt real, though. The house was perfect, affordable with enough space for me and my dog, a 7-year-old lab mix named Murphy. The owner, a quiet older man named Harris, said he'd inherited it from his brother and just didn't want to keep up with it anymore. I signed the lease within a week and moved in the following weekend. The first couple of days were normal, peaceful even. I unpacked, cleaned, and spent the evenings out on the porch with a glass of iced tea, listening to the cicadas hum in the trees. The neighbors waved but didn't pry, which I appreciated. Murphy loved the backyard, darting around in wide circles until he collapsed in the grass, panting happily. The first odd thing happened on the third night. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of scratching. It was faint, like nails dragging against wood, and at first I thought Murphy had gotten into something. I sat up, heart thudding, and called his name. He padded in from the hallway, tail wagging sleepily, clearly not the culprit. The scratching stopped. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the siding outside, maybe from the storm that had rolled through earlier. I went back to bed. The next morning I found deep, straight scratches along the inside of the basement door. They were about 3 feet high, too uniform for an animal, too deliberate. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the marks in the dim light, before shaking it off. Maybe the previous tenant had a cat. Maybe they just never bothered to repaint. By the end of that week, though, I couldn't ignore the little things anymore. Doors that I was sure I'd closed were standing open when I came back into the room. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway when Murphy and I were the only ones there. Sometimes I'd hear soft humming, just a note or two, coming from somewhere deep in the house. I kept telling myself I was just adjusting to the quiet. City noise had been my constant for years, and now that I didn't have sirens and traffic outside my window, every creak of the house felt amplified. But then Murphy started acting strange. At first it was subtle. He'd stop mid-play in the yard and stare at the tree line, ears perked, tail stiff. Then he started refusing to go down the hallway at night. He'd plant his paws, whimper, and look up at me with wide, pleading eyes. One evening, I found him sitting perfectly still in the living room, his gaze locked on the darkened corner near the basement door. The fur along his back was raised, his body tense, but he didn't growl or bark, just stared, unblinking, until I called him away. I thought about calling Harris, asking if anything strange had happened when his brother lived there, but I couldn't bring myself to make the call. It felt ridiculous, like I'd be admitting I was scared of my own house. Instead, I started keeping the lights on at night. That was when the dreams began. They weren't nightmares, exactly. Not at first. I'd dream of walking through the house, only it wasn't mine anymore. The walls were a deep, suffocating red, and the windows were boarded up, blocking out every trace of light. I'd wander room to room, searching for something I couldn't name until I reached the basement door. And every time, just as I reached for the handle, I'd wake up. After the fourth night in a row of the same dream, I decided to go down there during the day, just to prove to myself there was nothing to be afraid of. The basement was unfinished, the concrete floor cold under my feet as I made my way down the narrow steps. It smelled like damp earth and something faintly metallic like old pennies. Boxes were stacked along the walls. Harris had said I could store things down there, but I hadn't moved much in yet. Everything looked normal. But when I turned to head back upstairs, I noticed something etched into the wooden beam near the bottom of the stairs. It was a name, Emma. The letters were carved deep, as if someone had pressed the blade in with purpose. I ran my fingers over the grooves, my stomach twisting. The wood around the name was dark, almost stained. That night, I dreamed again. Only this time the dream didn't end at the door. I opened it, stepped inside, and saw her. She was sitting on the basement floor, her back against the far wall. Long, dark hair hung in front of her face, and she was humming, soft and low, the same note I'd been hearing in the house for weeks. When I called out to her, she stopped, lifting her head just enough for me to see the hollow black of her eyes. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, Murphy whining anxiously at the side of the bed. After that, things escalated. Objects moved. Small at first, like a coffee mug or a set of keys, but then larger things. A chair I'd left tucked under the kitchen table would be pulled out, angled sharply toward the hallway. Picture frames shifted on the walls, sometimes falling in the middle of the night with a sharp, echoing crash. I started hearing the humming more often, too. Not just at night, but in the middle of the day, faint and almost playful, like it was following me from room to room. I didn't sleep much. One evening, I woke to the sound of Murphy growling, deep and low. When I opened my eyes, I saw him standing at the edge of the bed, his gaze locked on the doorway, and in the dark, just beyond the threshold, I saw her. She was standing there, motionless, her hair still hanging in tangled strands across her face. I froze, every muscle in my body locked tight, and then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she was gone. I packed a bag that night, ready to leave, but when I tried to start my car, the engine wouldn't turn over. It took 3 tries before it finally roared to life, and even then, I couldn't make myself drive away. Something about the house held me there, like invisible threads pulling me back toward it. I spent the rest of the night on the porch, Murphy pressed against my side, both of us staring out at the dark tree line until the first light of dawn broke through. The next day, I called Harris. I didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Who's Emma?" I asked. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a heavy sigh. "I told my brother to take that name out," Harris muttered, almost to himself. "I told him." He didn't want to tell me at first, but eventually the story came out. Emma had lived in the house years ago, long before Harris's brother inherited it. She'd been a young woman, quiet and shy, who mostly kept to herself. No one really knew what had happened, but one night, neighbors heard screaming. By the time anyone called the sheriff, the house was silent. They found her in the basement, no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints but hers. They said she did it to herself, Harris said, his voice low. But folks around here, they always said it didn't feel right, like something in that house wasn't hers to fight. After that call, I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. I kept a bag packed by the door, just in case, but something told me leaving wouldn't be that simple. And then, one night, I woke up to the sound of the basement door creaking open. Murphy started barking, loud and frantic, and I grabbed the flashlight I'd been keeping by the couch. The door was wide open. The humming was louder now, filling every corner of the house, weaving through the walls like a living thing. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, flashlight trembling in my hand. And then, from the darkness below, a voice whispered my name. Soft, almost sweet. I don't remember what happened after that. Just fragments. Murphy barking, the sound of footsteps racing up behind me, a cold hand closing around my wrist. When I came to, it was morning. I was lying on the living room floor, Murphy curled tightly against me. The basement door was shut. I left that afternoon. Didn't pack anything except the essentials. Just threw everything into my car, has called a locksmith to change the locks after I was gone, and drove until the town was a blur in my rearview mirror. I've been gone for months now, staying with a friend in North Carolina, but sometimes at night when the house is quiet and the world feels still, I hear it again, that low, soft humming, and I know somehow that Emma isn't finished with me. Story the end. I was 17 the summer my parents bought the house in rural Pennsylvania. It was one of those old farmhouses, the kind that sat on the edge of an overgrown field, its white paint faded to a dull gray, and its porch sagging just enough to creak when you stepped on it. My mother fell in love with it instantly, said it had character, while my father muttered about how much work it was going to take to keep it from falling apart. I didn't care much either way. I was angry about moving, leaving my friends back in Harrisburg, and all I could think about was how isolated this place felt. The nearest neighbor was nearly a mile down the road, and our driveway was a long gravel path that crunched under the tires every time someone came or went. The first night we spent there, I barely slept. The house made noises I wasn't used to. The groan of the floorboards settling, the soft rush of wind through gaps in the old window frames, the distant hum of crickets that seemed to rise and fall like waves. Around 2 a.m, I sat up in bed, certain I'd heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. But when I cracked the door open, the house was still and silent, and I told myself it was just my imagination. It didn't feel haunted at first. Not really. But there was something heavy about the house. Like when you walk into a room right after someone's had an argument, and the air feels thick, even if you didn't hear the words. A week after we moved in, I was in the backyard helping my dad clean up a collapsed shed when I found it. A small, rusted tin box buried just under the dirt near the tree line. The latch was so corroded I had to pry it open with a rock. Inside there were a few old photographs, the edges curled and faded almost to sepia, and a brittle piece of paper folded into quarters. The photos were strange. One of them showed the house as it must have looked decades ago, the paint bright, the yard neat, but there were no people in it. Another had a blurry figure near the porch steps, though the face was smudged like the film had been exposed. The paper was worse. In this spidery handwriting, barely legible, someone had scrawled, "Don't let her in, no matter what you hear." I showed it to my dad, and he brushed it off like it was nothing. "Probably some kids messing around," he said. This place has been empty a long time. Don't let it get in your head." But that night, I started to hear it again. It always started the same way, soft, deliberate footsteps in the upstairs hallway. At first, I thought it was my mom or dad, maybe just restless in the night. But when I'd peek out, the hallway would be empty and my parents' door would be closed. Then, about 2 weeks in, the knocking started. The first time it was just a faint tap, tap, tap on my bedroom door, so quiet I thought maybe it was a branch against the siding. But then it came again the next night, louder this time. 3 knocks. Always 3. I remember lying there, frozen under my blanket, my eyes fixed on the shadow of the door across the room. I told myself not to move, not to make a sound, and eventually the knocking stopped. I didn't say anything to my parents. It felt stupid, like something a little kid would complain about. But I started keeping my phone under my pillow, just in case. It wasn't until late August, after a long day of painting the kitchen, that I actually saw her. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water sometime after midnight. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't even turn on the kitchen light, just grabbed a glass and filled it at the tap. And then, in the reflection of the dark window above the sink, I saw her standing at the edge of the yard. She was just there, still. A woman in what looked like a pale dress, the kind you see in old photographs. Her hair was dark and loose, her face pale even in the dim light spilling out from the house. I froze. I didn't even breathe. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe one of the neighbors had wandered up the driveway. But when I turned to look, she was gone. The yard was empty, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. I told myself I imagined it, that I was overtired and freaked myself out. But deep down, I knew what I saw. Over the next few weeks, she started coming closer. Sometimes I'd wake up and find my bedroom window cracked open. even though I knew I'd locked it before bed. Other times I'd catch glimpses of her, at the tree line near the shed, once even at the far end of the porch, her head tilted slightly like she was listening. And then the dreams started. Every night, I'd dream I was standing at the top of the staircase, the house completely dark. I could hear footsteps below me, slow and deliberate, moving from room to room. And then, just before I woke, I'd hear a woman's voice whispering right in my ear, "Let me in." I didn't tell my parents until the night it all came to a head. It was a Saturday, late September, and a storm had rolled in that afternoon. The rain hammered the roof, and the wind howled around the corners of the house. The power went out around 10, plunging everything into darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard the footsteps again. Slow. Heavy. Coming down the hallway toward my room. I held my breath, waiting for the knocking, but this time there was nothing. Just silence. And then, from outside, I heard her voice. It was soft at first, almost drowned out by the storm. "Please, let me in. Please." I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. The voice came again, closer this time, right outside my window. "Please, it's so cold out here. Please let me in." I scrambled off the bed and back toward the door, fumbling for my phone. The screen lit up just long enough for me to see the battery was dead. Then came the sound of the window latch lifting. That was when I screamed. By the time my parents burst into the room with flashlights, the window was shut again, the curtains swaying gently like someone had just let go of them. I was shaking, sobbing, trying to explain, but they kept saying it was just the storm, just my imagination. My dad stayed up with me the rest of the night, sitting in a chair by the window, but nothing happened after that. The next morning, when the rain stopped and the light returned, there were footprints in the mud outside my window. Bare footprints. Small, narrow, leading up to the side of the house, and then stopping. We moved out less than a month later. My parents said it was because the commute to work was too long, but I knew better. Even now, years later, I can still hear her sometimes when I can't sleep, that soft, desperate voice, just outside the edge of my dreams. "Please, let me in." Story the end. The night was quiet, except for the soft hum of the box fan in the corner of my room. I've always needed some kind of white noise to fall asleep, and in that small second-floor apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, it was my only defense against the stillness that crept in after midnight. I had moved there the summer after graduating college, excited to finally live on my own. The apartment was nothing special, just a narrow one-bedroom on the edge of downtown, but it felt like freedom. The first month was uneventful. My days were filled with work at the local bookstore, and my nights were spent either cooking simple dinners or streaming shows until I drifted off to sleep. But by the second month, little things started happening. Things I told myself were nothing. At first, it was sounds. Footsteps above me when I knew the upstairs unit was vacant. The sound of water dripping in the kitchen when I had double-checked that the faucet was tightly turned off. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was just the building settling, just old pipes groaning in the summer heat. One night, around 2 a.m, I woke up to the faint smell of cigarette smoke. It was strange because I didn't smoke, and the building had a strict non-smoking policy. The scent was strong, as if someone was standing right next to my bed. I remember sitting up slowly, blinking into the darkness, convinced that maybe I had left a window cracked. But when I checked, the windows were locked tight. The smell lingered for a while, fading as the sun started to rise. I brushed it off, telling myself it had to have drifted in from the street somehow. But the next night, the smell returned. Stronger this time, sharp and acrid. And this time, there was something else. I heard breathing. Not just any breathing, but deep, slow, deliberate breaths, as if someone was standing in the corner of my room. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just lay there, frozen, staring into the dark until, just like before, the sound faded and the smell vanished with it. By the third week of these disturbances, I started to keep a journal, writing down everything that happened. I wanted to keep track of the strange occurrences, hoping that maybe it would help me find some kind of explanation. But instead, the entries became a log of things I couldn't rationalize. Scratching sounds along the walls, the distinct feeling of someone brushing past me in the narrow hallway, my cat Daisy, hissing at empty corners of the room, her fur puffed up, tail rigid. One Saturday night, after a long shift, I came home around midnight. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. Something different, heavy, like the air was thicker than usual. Daisy bolted under the couch the second I opened the door. I remember laughing nervously, trying to shake off the sense of unease as I tossed my keys on the counter. I walked into the bedroom to change, and that's when I saw it. The closet door, which I always kept shut, was wide open. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. I was certain I hadn't left it like that. I took a tentative step toward it, peering into the darkness of the small closet. Nothing. Just my clothes hanging neatly, shoes lined up at the bottom. I told myself I must have forgotten to close it that morning, but as I shut the door, I caught sight of something in the mirror hanging on the wall opposite the closet. A shadow. Brief. Just for a split second, a tall, thin figure standing right behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I whipped around, but the room was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, exhausted and jittery, I went downstairs to talk to my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan. She had lived in the building for decades, the kind of older woman who always knew everyone's business. When I told her about the strange things happening in my apartment, she went quiet. She stared at me for a long moment before asking, almost reluctantly, "You're in 2B, right?" When I nodded, she sighed and said, "That unit's had some history." I pressed her for more, and eventually she told me about the man who used to live there. His name was Robert, a middle-aged man who mostly kept to himself. He'd been there for years, quiet but polite. About 5 years ago, though, something in him changed. Neighbors said they'd hear him talking to himself late at night, yelling sometimes, like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. Then one night, the yelling stopped, and the smell of cigarette smoke started seeping into the hallway. When no one saw him for days, the landlord finally went in and found him in the bedroom. He died sitting up in bed, cigarettes still smoldering in the ashtray. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just an old story meant to spook newcomers, but deep down, I knew better. The smell of smoke, the breathing, the shadow. I couldn't deny the connection. From that point on, things escalated. It wasn't just sounds or smells anymore. It was objects moving. I'd leave my keys on the counter and find them in the bathroom. My bedroom door would slam shut on its own, even when there was no draft. One night, I woke to the sound of someone whispering my name, soft, drawn out, right next to my ear. I remember sitting bolt upright, clutching the sheets, whispering into the darkness, "Who's there?" My voice shook. There was no answer, only that oppressive silence and the faintest hint of smoke curling through the air. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. Whatever it was didn't care about light. Daisy stopped sleeping in the bedroom altogether, choosing instead to curl up by the front door, as if she wanted to be ready to bolt at any moment. One night, after another long shift, I came home to find every cabinet in the kitchen standing wide open. Every single one. I stood in the doorway, too stunned to move, the hair on my arms standing on end. I whispered, "Please stop," my voice breaking. The air felt charged, electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. Slowly, the cabinet doors began to swing shut, one by one, until the kitchen was silent again. That was the night I called my mom. I tried to keep my voice steady, not wanting to scare her, but the moment I told her what was happening, she said, "Honey, you need to get out of there." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I couldn't afford to break my lease, and there were no other apartments in my budget. So I stayed. By late October, I was barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. My coworkers started to notice. They'd comment on how pale I looked, how jumpy I'd become. I didn't tell them the truth. Who would believe me? Then came the night that broke me. It was a Thursday, clear and cool, the kind of fall night where the air feels sharp in your lungs. I got home around 10, went through my usual routine, and climbed into bed. Sometime after 2, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, getting closer to my bedroom. I sat up, my heart hammering, and whispered, "Hello?" No answer. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Then the doorknob turned. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The door didn't open, but the knob kept turning, rattling violently now, like someone on the other side was trying to get in. Daisy hissed from the living room, a deep, guttural sound I'd never heard from her before. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, until I heard it. A whisper, low and close, right next to my ear. "Get out." I didn't move. I couldn't. My whole body was shaking, tears streaming down my face as I sat there, paralyzed with fear. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I stayed with a coworker for a week before breaking my lease, no matter the cost. I didn't care anymore. Even now, years later, I can still smell the smoke sometimes, sharp and sudden, out of nowhere. I'll be driving or folding laundry or lying in bed, and there it is, that same acrid scent curling in the air around me. I moved across town into a newer building with no history, no stories. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is still, I swear I can hear it again. That slow, deliberate breathing just beyond the edge of the dark. Story the end. I moved to a small town in upstate New York in early September, seeking a quiet place to finish the last semester of my graduate program. The town was dotted with old houses, long stretches of forest, and a river that cut through the middle like a slow-moving vein. I found a rental house at the end of a narrow road, a 2-story colonial that looked charming in the photos online. In person, it had a kind of weathered dignity, the kind of place that had seen decades pass through it. The porch sagged slightly, the paint on the shutters was peeling, and the yard was overgrown. But I didn't mind. It had the privacy I wanted, and I was used to older houses. The first day was spent unpacking and settling in. I brought Max, my golden retriever, with me, and he explored every room with curiosity, pausing at corners and sniffing the air. Normally confident, he seemed hesitant here, pausing at the top of the stairs, ears flat, tail low. I joked to myself that he was just sensing new surroundings. The first night, I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and the old floors groaned under their own weight. Max refused to sleep in my room, instead curling up by the door, ears twitching at every creak. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke to a faint whispering. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but Max bolted upright, hackles raised, with a low growl rumbling in his throat. The whispering didn't form words, but it was unmistakable and came from the hallway outside my bedroom. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed, voice shaking as I called, "Hello?" Silence followed, then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving down the hall. Max growled, pacing along the bed. The footsteps stopped at my bedroom door for a moment before fading down the hallway. I lay awake until dawn, heart hammering, unable to breathe normally. The next morning, I noticed small things out of place. A chair slightly shifted, a blanket folded differently, the kitchen drawer ajar. Nothing major, but enough to make me uneasy. I began keeping a notebook next to the bed, jotting down every strange event. Doors opening or closing, items moving, whispering, Max's unusual behavior. Over the next week, the activity increased. Objects moved more frequently, doors slammed, books fell off shelves, and sometimes I heard muffled murmurs from rooms I wasn't in. Max refused to go upstairs, whining softly, staring at spots that looked empty to me. I tried to rationalize it, drafts my imagination, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. One morning I spoke to a neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived in town for decades. I asked about the house's history. She hesitated before answering. People who've lived there, they always felt watched. Some hear footsteps, voices, some leave suddenly. Years ago, a young woman died in that upstairs bedroom. Some say her spirit never left, she said. A chill ran down my spine. That night, the house felt different. Shadows clung to corners, even with lights on. I was sitting in the living room when I heard the faucet running in the kitchen. I ran to turn it off, but as soon as I touched it, the water stopped. Then came footsteps upstairs, deliberate, frantic. Max barked frantically, ears flat, growling. I froze, clutching the bat, and shone the flashlight up the stairs. At the end of the hallway, I saw her, a woman in a long, faded dress, pale, hair floating as though underwater. She didn't move, just watched. I whispered, "I mean no harm. I just want to live here in peace." She lingered for a moment, then slowly vanished. The footsteps and whispers stopped, but the air remained cold and heavy. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quietly, taking care not to disturb anything. Max stayed close, alert and nervous. I left at dawn, not looking back. The house stood silent behind me, shadowed and waiting. Months later, in my new apartment in town, I sometimes hear faint whispers late at night or catch movement out of the corner of my eye. I tell myself it's my imagination, a remnant of that old house. But when the house is quiet and the wind blows just right, I swear I can feel her presence, patient, sorrowful, waiting in that old home at the edge of the woods. The day I researched the house, I found public records and a newspaper clipping about Margaret Klein, the woman who had died there decades ago. The reports were vague. Some hinted at an accident, some a dispute, but no clear cause. It fit with the neighbor's account. Margaret never really left the house. Even now, I have recurring dreams. I'm walking down the hallway, and she's there, standing at the end, watching silently. I wake with Max staring at the corner of the room, ears flat, growling softly. I've tried to explain it to friends, but they dismiss it as stress or imagination. Maybe they're right. But Max's behavior, the sensations I felt in the house, the presence, it wasn't something I could have imagined. I've learned to live with it. I leave lights on at night, keep Max close, and never linger in silence. Sometimes late at night, I feel her watching, patient, sad, waiting for someone to notice her. She isn't dangerous, just trapped, lingering in the old farmhouse at the edge of town. Even as life goes on, I can't shake the memory of the wait in that hallway, the whispers, and the feeling of being observed. It follows me sometimes, subtle, a reminder that some things never really leave. Max senses it too, reacting to shadows, sniffing the air, refusing to settle. I've come to accept it as part of my life now, a presence just beyond my perception, sad, patient, and eternal. There are nights when I dream of the farmhouse. I walk the hallway slowly, careful not to step too loudly. She is at the end, still, watching. I reach out, but she doesn't move. I wake, heart racing, with Max pressed close to me, staring at the dark corners of the room. The experience left its mark. It wasn't just fear, it was a weight of history, a life trapped in that house, lingering long after death. I sometimes wonder what she would say if she could speak. Would she ask for help, for release? Or would she simply wait for the next person to notice, to feel the sorrow she carries? I don't know. I don't want to go back to find out. But on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the trees in a particular way, I feel her presence, and I remember that some ghosts don't leave. They just wait. Story the end. I moved to a small town in upstate New York during the fall of 2018. I was looking for something quiet, away from the city chaos, a place where the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hoot of owls. I found a 2-story house on the edge of town, isolated but charming, with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that creaked under my weight. The real estate agent, a thin man with a nervous smile named Curtis, mentioned that the house had been empty for nearly a year after its previous owner had passed away. He told me that neighbors sometimes mentioned strange things happening there, but he quickly laughed it off and assured me the house was perfectly fine. The first week went smoothly. I unpacked boxes, set up a writing desk near the window that faced the backyard, and let my dog Rusty, a 10-year-old beagle, explore the house. Nights were quiet, almost unnervingly so. The old floors creaked under my weight, the pipes groaned as water cooled or heated, but nothing seemed unusual at first. Then, on the 8th night, I woke around 2:47 a.m. to the sound of Rusty growling at the far corner of the bedroom. I opened my eyes, expecting him to be reacting to some small noise outside, but the window was shut and the wind was barely stirring the branches. A faint scratching came from the hallway outside the bedroom. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was dragging nails across the wooden floor. My heart began to race. I whispered Rusty's name, and he didn't move from his position, still staring rigidly toward the hallway. I stayed perfectly still until the scratching stopped. The next morning, I found a shallow groove along the hallway floorboards, barely visible but unmistakably a scratch. Rusty refused to go down the hallway when I tried to lead him, growling and pulling back. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just an old floor defect or a scratch from furniture moving. But the events escalated. Objects shifted from their usual places. A coffee cup would be in the middle of the living room floor, despite being on the counter the night before. The kitchen table would be pushed a few inches from the wall. Lights flickered intermittently, and sometimes I would hear soft humming, a melodic tone that seemed to move with me from room to room. Rusty's behavior grew more unusual. He would stop mid-step and stare into corners, ears back, tail stiff. Sometimes he would whimper as if someone unseen was standing nearby. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I was stressed from moving. Maybe the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But it wasn't just me noticing things. Rusty was reacting to something invisible but tangible. One evening, I heard the humming more clearly. It was coming from the staircase leading to the second floor. I approached cautiously, Rusty following closely, ears perked, tail low. The air grew colder the closer we got. I reached the top of the stairs and saw her. A young woman stood at the far end of the hallway. She was wearing a long, pale dress, her hair dark and loose, obscuring most of her face. She didn't move or speak, just stood there staring. Rusty growled low, hackles raised, but he didn't attack. The sight of her made my stomach churn, a deep, unsettling dread that I couldn't shake. I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the living room couch, Rusty on my lap, staring at the hallway, afraid of what I might see. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a dream. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I contacted the local library and town archives, trying to find any record of the house's history. I discovered that a woman named Eleanor had lived there in the 1960s. She had died under strange circumstances. Some reports suggested a domestic accident, others hinted at foul play, but nothing conclusive was ever recorded. Neighbors remembered hearing her singing or humming late at night before her death, sometimes seen walking in the backyard alone, looking distressed. Over the next few weeks, I began documenting everything: the times she appeared, the sounds, the objects that moved. I noticed a pattern. Most activity happened between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always near the staircase or the hallway outside my bedroom. Rusty's reactions mirrored the events, confirming that whatever was happening, it wasn't my imagination. I started leaving small offerings along the hallway where she appeared most often: a candle, a glass of water, sometimes a flower. The movements shifted slightly. The footsteps became quieter, the objects moved less aggressively, and Rusty's tension eased. One night, determined to communicate, I sat on the stairs holding a candle and whispered, "Eleanor, I'm here. I want to help you. Can you tell me why you're still here?" The house was silent for a long moment, and then a soft voice whispered, "I can't leave. I'm trapped." I realized then that she was bound to the house by fear, trauma, or unfinished business. I began nightly conversations, offering reassurance, acknowledging her presence, and listening for responses through subtle signs: taps, shifts of objects, fleeting shadows. I paid attention to the mirror in the hallway, where she appeared most frequently, and spent long nights speaking to her, coaxing her to release her fear, to find peace. Weeks passed. The house grew calmer. The footsteps slowed, the humming faded, and Rusty navigated the hallways without panic. One night, Eleanor appeared fully in the mirror's reflection. Her eyes, once hollow, seemed softer. She whispered, "Thank you," and slowly faded. The hallway remained quiet for the first time since I moved in. I continued living there for over a year without incident. The house felt alive but not threatening, peaceful rather than oppressive. I finally slept through nights. Rusty curled at my feet, and I could write without distraction. The lessons Eleanor taught me stayed with me. Not all spirits linger out of malice. Many remain because they are lost, trapped by trauma, and need acknowledgement, patience, and compassion to find their way to peace. Even now, years later, when I drive past that house, I sometimes feel a soft warmth, almost like a quietness watching over it. On certain nights, in moments of silence, I swear I hear a faint humming, distant but soothing, as if she is finally free and grateful. Story the end. I moved to a small town in rural Maine in the early fall, seeking solitude and a break from city life. My job as a freelance journalist allowed me to work from anywhere, and the town's quiet charm drew me in. I rented a modest 2-story house on the outskirts, near a dense patch of forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to the property. The house was older, built in the late 1800s, with weathered clapboard siding and a wraparound porch that had begun to sag in places. The real estate agent assured me it had been well maintained, though a few renovations were needed. I didn't mind. I wanted character, a place with history, and this house had it in abundance. The first night I slept lightly, the unfamiliar creaks of the old house keeping me alert. The floorboards groaned under even the softest step, and the wind rattled the windows in a way that made me tense. I told myself it was normal. Old houses had their quirks, but I could not ignore the sensation that I was not entirely alone. I dismissed it as imagination. By the second week, I began to notice small oddities. I would leave a book on the kitchen table and return to find it on the counter. A cup I had left on the windowsill would be moved to the edge of the sink. Nothing was broken or missing, just subtly rearranged. At first, I attributed it to absent-mindedness, though I was generally careful and methodical in my habits. Then came the footsteps. They started faint, almost imperceptible at first, like someone walking across the hardwood floor above me while I was writing at the desk in the living room. At first, I thought a neighbor had entered the house by mistake, though I was alone. The footsteps would stop abruptly whenever I moved to investigate, leaving only silence. On one occasion, I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, flashlight in hand, and found nothing. The rooms were empty, dust motes drifting in the lamp's glow. But the sense of being watched remained. One night, around midnight, I woke to the sound of a soft whisper. It was difficult to make out at first, barely audible, almost like the wind brushing against the walls. But then I distinctly heard my name. Sarah. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening. My apartment was quiet, the only sounds the occasional rustle of trees outside and the hum of the heating system. I called out, "Who's there?" No response, only silence, heavier than before. I tried to convince myself it was a dream or my mind playing tricks in the darkness, but the whisper repeated itself a few minutes later. The phenomenon grew more pronounced over the following weeks. I began to hear not just footsteps and whispers, but the faint creak of doors opening and closing. I would wake in the middle of the night to find the bedroom door slightly ajar, even though I remembered closing it. I began leaving notes on the kitchen table, simple messages like, "Who are you?" and "Do you need help?" Sometimes the notes would remain untouched. Other times I would find them folded neatly in half or moved to the counter. One particularly stormy night, the activity escalated. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and I was sitting at my desk when I felt a sudden chill, the temperature dropping noticeably. The chair across the room moved slightly, and the faint smell of old wood and something else, like damp earth, filled the air. I heard footsteps pacing in the hallway outside my room, deliberate and slow. My hands trembled as I grabbed a flashlight and shone it down the hall, but there was nothing. I whispered, "I see you. Please, show yourself if you need me to understand," and the footsteps stopped. I began researching the history of the house. Built in 1883, it had been a farmhouse originally, then converted into a private residence in the 1960s. Several previous occupants had passed away within its walls. The most notable was a woman named Margaret Hale, who lived there in the 1940s and died under mysterious circumstances. Local records suggested she had been alone when she died, and there were whispers in town of strange occurrences reported by tenants afterward, but nothing documented officially. As November arrived, the presence became more defined. It was no longer just movements or sounds, but a sense of being observed, acknowledged. I began speaking aloud at night, addressing the presence directly. "I know you're here," I would say softly. "I want to understand you." Sometimes, I would wake to find small items moved in response. A book open on the page I had left it on, a chair turned slightly toward me, a curtain pulled back. The interactions were subtle but unmistakable. Dreams accompanied the activity. I started dreaming of a woman, always distant at first, standing at the edge of the forest behind the house. She never spoke but watched me with sad, intent eyes. Over time, the dreams grew clearer. I would find myself walking through the house, moving through familiar rooms, and she would follow silently. Occasionally, she would reach out, her hand brushing against my shoulder, never touching, just a sensation of presence. I would wake sweating, heart racing, the memory of her gaze lingering long after consciousness returned. One evening, as snow began to fall early and settle on the ground, the presence became almost tangible. I was sitting by the fireplace, the orange glow casting long shadows like when I felt the air shift behind me. I turned slightly, sensing her just beyond vision. A whisper, soft and deliberate, said, "Stay." My breath caught, and I could feel the weight of her longing, a grief that had lingered for decades. I whispered back, "You're safe. You can rest." The room seemed to exhale, a soft warmth replacing the chill, and I felt a sense of peace settle over the space. The weeks that followed brought a fragile calm. The activity didn't cease entirely, but it was gentler, less insistent. The footsteps slowed, the whispers became faint sighs, and the subtle rearrangement of items occurred only occasionally. I continued leaving notes, speaking softly in the quiet hours, acknowledging her presence. It was no longer fear I felt, but companionship of an unusual kind, an understanding that some souls lingered not to harm but to be recognized. By the time winter fully set in, I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the house. The presence was no longer an intrusion but a part of life in the small farmhouse. I would sit quietly by the fire, the faint sound of footsteps above, the occasional whisper, and I would smile, feeling a connection that transcended time. I knew she had been Margaret Hale, a woman tied to the house by history and solitude, and in my acknowledgement, she had found a measure of peace. Eventually, life pulled me elsewhere. I moved to another town for work, leaving the farmhouse behind. The activity ceased entirely once I left, the house falling silent as if the presence had finally moved on. Yet the memories stayed with me, an imprint on my understanding of fear, grief, and recognition. In quiet moments, especially on cold, windy nights, I can still feel the weight of her gaze in my memory, the soft sighs of a soul once lost and now remembered, and I know that some presences are not meant to terrify but to remind us that connection extends beyond life, that acknowledgement can transform fear into understanding, and that even those who have passed may leave a gentle imprint of their existence on the living. Story the end. I moved to a small town in Pennsylvania during the late fall, drawn by the quiet streets and the older houses that lined them, their weathered siding and crooked chimneys giving the town a timeless feel. I wasn't planning to stay long, just long enough to finish a freelance project I had taken on. But something about the area felt right. Maybe it was the way the fog rolled over the fields in the mornings, or the way the trees leaned in close to the roads, casting long, crooked shadows that reminded me of old photographs. The house I rented was a 2-story Victorian at the edge of town. From the street, it looked charming, with its gabled roof and wraparound porch. Inside, the floors creaked and settled in ways I hadn't expected, and the smell of aged wood mixed with the faint scent of mildew followed me from room to room. The landlord assured me that the previous tenants had left quickly. No harm done, and that any lingering smells were just the house settling. I didn't care much. I liked it anyway. The first few nights were quiet. I unpacked, arranged my workspace near the large bay window, and watched the sunset spill over the distant hills while Max, my dog, explored every corner of the house. Max was normally easygoing, but he seemed hesitant here, pausing at the top of the stairs or barking at corners where I didn't think anything could be. I laughed it off, blaming the new surroundings and his sensitive nature. The first sign that something was off came a week in. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, the old house letting out creaks and groans. But the whispering didn't come from the walls. It came from the hallway. My bedroom door was closed, but I could hear faint voices, low and almost pleading. Max growled softly, his hackles raised, and I froze, straining to make sense of what I was hearing. The voices stopped as suddenly as they started. I convinced myself it had been a dream, that maybe I had been half awake and imagined it. But Max didn't sleep the rest of the night, pacing in circles and occasionally growling at spots along the wall. The next morning, I found a few small things out of place. A chair in the living room had been moved slightly, a blanket folded differently than I had left it. It wasn't anything major, but it was enough to make me pause. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, jotting down odd occurrences. Things moving, shadows flickering, Max's nervous behavior. Over the next few weeks, the activity increased. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps upstairs, even though I lived alone. Doors would open and close on their own, and sometimes I would hear the sound of a chair scraping across the floor as if someone had been sitting at my desk. One night, I woke up to the feeling of someone standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could sense it. Something there, watching. Max was trembling beside me, and I didn't dare move until dawn. I started talking to neighbors, trying to find out if the house had a history. Most of them were polite but distant, shrugging when I asked about previous tenants or any strange events. One older man, sitting on his porch a few houses down, finally spoke. He told me the house had been empty for years at times and that people who stayed there often complained about feeling watched or hearing voices. He said some even left abruptly, unable to handle the presence. I nodded politely, not wanting to admit I was already beginning to understand what he meant. One rainy night, the events escalated. I was in the kitchen making tea when the lights flickered and went out. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check the breaker, but the hallways were filled with shadows that seemed to shift as I moved. I could hear whispers again, this time more distinct. They were calling my name, low and urgent. Max barked, and I realized he was staring at the stairwell. I froze, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I went upstairs cautiously, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. In the hallway, I saw the silhouette of a woman, faint but clear, standing at the end of the hall. She wore a long dress, and her hair seemed to float around her face. I blinked, and she was gone, leaving only the echo of footsteps that didn't match my own. After that night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed in the living room. Max curled up at my feet, keeping watch. Objects moved more frequently now, books off shelves, doors left open, the faucet running when no one was in the kitchen. Sometimes I would hear soft crying from the upstairs bedrooms. The house was alive in a way I hadn't anticipated, and it wasn't friendly. I decided to reach out to someone who might understand, a local historian who specialized in the area's old homes. She came by during the day, and I showed her the house. She walked slowly through each room, her eyes widening as she felt the energy. She explained that the house had a long history, dating back over 100 years, and that there were records of a woman who had died in the upstairs bedroom under mysterious circumstances. She suggested that the spirit of this woman might still linger, attached to the house. Armed with this knowledge, I tried to coexist, keeping my routines and avoiding provoking the presence. But it wasn't easy. Nights were long, filled with whispers, footsteps, and cold drafts that seemed to follow me. Max was my only comfort, always alert, always protective. One particularly stormy night, the events reached a peak. Rain hammered the roof, and lightning illuminated the hallway in sudden flashes. I heard the crying again, louder this time, and footsteps moving through the living room as if someone was pacing. I grabbed the flashlight and followed the sounds, and in the dining room I saw her again, the woman in the long dress. She turned her head slowly toward me, and I felt an overwhelming sadness, a sense of despair that made me physically weak. She didn't move closer, but I could feel her attention on me, heavy and suffocating. I tried speaking to her, saying I meant no harm, that I just wanted to live here peacefully. The crying stopped, and the footsteps faded, but the air remained heavy, charged with her presence. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed my things quietly, avoiding any loud noises that might draw attention. Max and I left at first light, the house looming behind us, quiet and still. I didn't look back, but I could feel the weight of her gaze on me as we drove away. Months later, I sometimes dream of that house, of the woman in the hallway, her eyes full of sorrow. I tell myself it was just a lingering spirit, trapped by the life she had lost, and that she never intended harm. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I swear I hear her whisper my name, soft and distant, reminding me that she's still there, waiting in that old Victorian at the edge of town. Story the end. It started the day I moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. I wasn't sure what drew me there. A mix of cheap rent, the quiet isolation, and maybe a subconscious desire to be somewhere that felt heavy with history. The house had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its paint peeling in long vertical strips, windows clouded with dust and grime, and a front porch that sagged dangerously in the center. The real estate agent had said it was charming in a rustic way, and left it at that. I didn't care. I was tired of the city, tired of the noise, tired of feeling like I couldn't breathe. The first night was uneventful. I carried my boxes up the narrow stairs, unpacked my essentials, and fell asleep to the hum of the old radiator that somehow still worked. It was quiet in a way that was almost too quiet. The kind of quiet where the wind through the trees sounds like whispers and the occasional owl call feels closer than it should. By the second night, I noticed small things. A door I was certain I'd closed would be slightly ajar in the morning. A kitchen chair that had been pushed against the table would be moved just enough that it was askew. I told myself I was just forgetful, tired from the drive and stressed from work. I ignored it. Then came the knocking. The first time, it was soft, rhythmic, almost polite. 3 knocks on the side of the house closest to the woods. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering, convinced it was a branch hitting the siding in the wind. I told myself it was nothing. But the knocking returned, the same rhythm, every night around 2 in the morning. 3 soft, deliberate knocks. Sometimes it was followed by silence, other times by faint scuffing, as if someone were pacing just outside. I began setting up small cameras around the house. Nothing too fancy, just enough to catch movement if someone was trying to break in. I told my landlord about it. He shrugged, muttering something about old houses and settled foundations, but refused to come see it himself. The nights became harder. I could hear the knocking even when the wind was calm, sometimes echoing inside the walls like it had a mind of its own. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, disappearing when I turned my head. The air would turn icy cold in spots for no reason, making my breath visible in the middle of July. One night I was sitting in the living room, the wind lashing against the windows, when I saw it. At first it was just a shape, a tall, thin figure standing at the edge of the porch. Its features were indistinct, blurred by the rain streaking down the glass, but it was watching me. I froze, unsure whether to run or stay put. It didn't move closer, didn't knock, didn't make a sound. Just stood there. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture, but when I looked at it, the figure was gone. Sleep became a distant memory. I'd wake in the middle of the night to the faint smell of smoke, though there was no fire. I'd hear whispers in the hallways, words I couldn't quite make out, soft and melodic, like someone humming under their breath. The more I stayed, the more I felt eyes on me, following me from room to room. One evening, I found an old diary tucked behind a loose floorboard in the attic. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, and the handwriting was spidery, rushed. It belonged to a woman named Margaret who had lived in the house in the 1800s. She wrote about her husband, a stern man who spent long hours in the fields, and her fear of a presence in the house, something that watched her from the shadows, something that moved when she wasn't looking. She described hearing knocks, footsteps, whispers, and cold spots. She wrote about locking herself in her room, praying through the night, and eventually leaving the house, never to return. Reading her words made my stomach twist. Everything she described matched what I had been experiencing. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence, that old houses have creaks, winds have whistles, and loneliness can make shadows seem alive. But deep down, I knew there was more. A week later, during a thunderstorm, the activity escalated. The knocking turned into banging, louder, more frantic, as if someone was trying to force their way in. The lights flickered, and the windows rattled violently. I stayed in the living room, gripping a baseball bat, heart pounding as the sounds surrounded me. Then came the whispers, louder this time, distinct enough that I could make out a single word repeated over and over: leave. I bolted for the door, convinced I had to get out. But as I reached for the handle, a cold hand seemed to brush against my shoulder. I spun around. Nothing. Just the empty room. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled outside into the rain, slipping in the mud, my clothes soaked through. I ran until I could no longer hear the house behind me. The next day, I didn't return. I packed what I could into my car and drove straight back to the city. I told myself I was done, that I would never set foot in that house again. But even weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Months passed and I tried to forget. Until one night, I received a message from an unknown number. A single photo, taken from inside the house, showing the empty living room. And in the corner, barely visible, was a shadowy figure with its head tilted, staring directly at the camera. Beneath the image, one word: still. I deleted the photo, blocked the number, tried to convince myself it was someone playing a prank. But sleep became impossible. Every creak of my apartment made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move with intention. I could feel it behind me in my peripheral vision, waiting. A year later, I returned to Gettysburg for work. Out of curiosity, I drove by the old farmhouse. The porch sagged even more, the paint peeled further, and the windows were darker than I remembered. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. But as I passed, I could swear I saw her, Margaret, standing at the top of the porch stairs, looking straight at me, her face pale and eyes hollow. She raised a finger, pointing at the house, then vanished. Since then, I never stayed alone in a house at night. I keep lights on, doors locked, and I avoid anything remotely isolated. But sometimes, when the wind whistles through the city streets or a shadow passes just out of the corner of my eye, I remember that farmhouse. And I remember the cold, the whispers, and the unmistakable feeling that some things in the world aren't meant to be alone, and some things will follow, no matter how far you run. Even now, when I lie in bed, I can't shake the thought of her, still standing there, waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear it. The faint sound of knocks, slow and deliberate, coming from a place I thought I had left behind. Story, the end. I moved to the small town of Millersville in Pennsylvania in the late summer of 2019. I needed a fresh start after a messy breakup and a job that had burned me out completely. Millersville wasn't exactly bustling. It was quiet, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business but didn't always share it unless it mattered. I had found a modest 2-story house on the edge of town, a rental that had been on the market for months. The owner, a woman named Margaret, was an elderly widow who claimed she wanted someone responsible and quiet to take care of the place. The house was old, built in the 1930s, but it had character. Hardwood floors, tall ceilings, and a creaky old staircase that led to 3 bedrooms upstairs. The first night I moved in, I unpacked my boxes, made a small dinner, and settled in with my cat, Daisy. The night was calm, almost too calm. There were occasional creaks from the floors, but I thought nothing of it. Old houses did that. Around 2 a.m, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps on the stairs. My cat was sleeping on the bed beside me, curled into a tight ball. I told myself it was my imagination. The stairs were old, maybe they had shifted in the night. But the footsteps continued, moving slowly, deliberately from the top of the stairs to the hallway outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, staring into the dark, heart racing. The sound stopped abruptly. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream. The house was old. I was stressed from the move. But when I walked upstairs to get my laundry, I noticed a faint footprint in the dust along the hallway floor, a woman's footprint, barefoot, small. It was odd because I had vacuumed thoroughly before leaving the house the night before. Daisy hissed at nothing as I passed the hallway, her fur bristling. The next few days were uneventful, though I started noticing little things out of place. A picture frame slightly tilted, a kitchen chair pulled out that I was certain I had pushed in, lights flickering briefly in rooms I wasn't in. Daisy began refusing to go into the hallway at night, staying close to me and growling softly at what seemed like empty space. One evening, I was sitting in the living room reading when I heard faint humming. At first, I thought it was a radio from a neighbor, but the sound was soft, melodic, and distinctly coming from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Daisy perked her ears, tail stiff, staring toward the darkness. The humming stopped as soon as I called out, and I convinced myself I had imagined it. The first vivid encounter happened a week after I moved in. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from unpacking, and had fallen into a deep sleep. Around 3 a.m, I awoke to a cold draft brushing across my face. My bedroom door was slightly open, and I could see a shadow standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, thin, with long dark hair obscuring her face, wearing a white nightgown. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I froze, heart hammering, too terrified to breathe. After what felt like minutes, she vanished. The next day, I tried to research the house. Margaret was reluctant to discuss much, but she eventually told me the previous tenant, a young woman named Lila, had disappeared without a trace nearly 10 years ago. The police found nothing. The house sat empty for years before she rented it to me. Margaret said she hadn't believed in ghosts, but admitted she sometimes felt a presence in the house herself, especially at night. I tried to dismiss it, tried to convince myself it was a combination of stress and sleep deprivation. But the occurrences escalated. Doors would slam shut by themselves, the objects would move from their usual spots, and Daisy's behavior became increasingly erratic. Sometimes I would hear whispering, almost like someone muttering words under their breath, just beyond my hearing. One night, I awoke to the sound of my bedroom door opening. Daisy was growling low, ears pinned back. The shadow appeared again, closer this time, and I noticed the outline of a face beneath the hair. Pale, gaunt, eyes hollow. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me, and then vanished. Terrified, I decided to stay with a friend for a few nights. During that time, I called the local police to ask about Lila. They confirmed her disappearance and told me that the investigation had gone cold, with no leads or evidence to explain what happened. Neighbors mentioned seeing a young woman wandering near the house late at night in the months before she disappeared, often talking to herself. Some said she seemed frightened of something. Returning to the house was difficult. I walked in cautiously, flashlight in hand, Daisy huddled under my arm. The house seemed heavier somehow, the air thick with a kind of oppressive stillness. That first night back, the humming returned, louder this time. It followed me from room to room, always just out of sight. Daisy hissed and growled, fur bristling, eyes wide. Then came the night I saw her clearly for the first time. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when the humming began. I looked up and saw her standing at the top of the staircase. Her hair fell in front of her face, but I could see the pale skin of her cheeks and the hollow darkness where her eyes should have been. She raised a hand and whispered, barely audible, "Help me." I stumbled back, tripping over a chair, and she vanished. The whispering continued even after she was gone, echoing through the house. I sat on the floor, shaking, holding Daisy close. I started keeping a notebook to document what I saw and heard. Every night I recorded footsteps, whispers, objects moving the times I saw her. Patterns emerged. She appeared most often between 2 and 4 a.m., always in the same hallway or at the top of the stairs. The humming was always melodic, sometimes faint, sometimes clear. One evening, I decided to confront her. I went upstairs, flashlight trembling in my hand, and called out, "Lila, are you here?" The house was silent. Then I heard it, soft sobbing from the hallway. I followed it, heart pounding, until I reached the corner where she usually appeared. She stood there, hands pressed to her face, shoulders shaking. "Why are you here?" I whispered. She lifted her head slowly. Her eyes deep, hollow, and sad, locked with mine. She opened her mouth and I heard her voice, soft and trembling. "I can't leave. I can't leave this place." I froze. It was then I realized she wasn't trying to harm me. She was trapped. Over the next weeks, I researched everything I could find about spirits, hauntings, and the history of the house. I learned that some spirits remain because of trauma or unfinished business. Lila hadn't harmed anyone, hadn't attacked me. She had disappeared, and the house had become her prison. I began trying to communicate more regularly. I would speak to her at night, asking what she needed, what kept her here. Sometimes she answered in whispers, sometimes through movement, tapping, knocking, or shifting objects. She seemed drawn to certain items, particularly an old mirror in the hallway. One night, I stayed up until dawn, sitting on the floor, holding the mirror. I asked her to show me what happened. Slowly, an image formed in the glass, a dark figure in the basement, looming over her. She ran, tried to hide, but the figure was always there. She screamed. I heard it clearly in my mind, echoing through the house. I knew then that she hadn't left because of the house itself. Something had happened in that basement, something so traumatic that it anchored her spirit there. I spent months researching, asking local historians, checking old police records. There was mention of a man, a tenant before Margaret's brother, who had a history of violence. The timeline matched. Lila's disappearance coincided with his time in the house. It seemed likely he had been responsible, though no charges were ever filed. Determined to help her, I began a nightly ritual. I would light candles, speak her name, and tell her she was safe. I left flowers near the mirror and whispered encouragement. Slowly, over weeks, the incidents began to change. The footsteps grew less frequent, the humming became less persistent. Daisy, once terrified of the hallway, would now walk it cautiously, tail low but no longer bristled. Then, one night, I saw her fully again, standing by the mirror. She looked calmer, her posture less tense. Her eyes, while still hollow, seemed softer. She whispered, "Thank you." before fading. The next morning, the mirror was untouched, the hallway quiet. For the first time since moving in, I felt truly alone in the house, but not empty. There was a sense of peace, as though the energy that had weighed down every room had lifted. Daisy curled up on the couch, purring softly, and I realized I could finally sleep through the night. Over the next year, I lived in that house without incident. The noises stopped, the shadows vanished, and the feeling of being watched dissipated. I sometimes think of Lila, wondering if she finally found rest. I never saw her again, but sometimes when the house is quiet and I sit in the living room at night, I swear I hear a soft hum, faint and distant, like a whisper of gratitude carried on the wind. I learned something important living there. Sometimes spirits aren't malevolent. They're just lost, trapped in the echoes of trauma. All they need is acknowledgement, understanding, and a little help to find their way home. Story the end. It was late October when I first moved into the small, aging house on the outskirts of a quiet town in Pennsylvania. The air had that sharp bite that hinted at winter, and the leaves along the streets were already turning deep crimson and gold, rustling with every gust of wind. I was drawn to the house for its charm, its cheap rent, and the promise of solitude. Being a freelance writer, I often worked late into the night, and I didn't mind the quiet. In fact, I welcomed it. What I didn't anticipate, however, was how very alive the quiet could feel, almost like it had a pulse of its own. The first few nights were normal enough. I unpacked boxes, arranged the sparse furniture, and tried to imagine what life would be like here in the months to come. The house was old, creaking with every step. Floorboards moaned under weight, and there was the occasional groan from the attic when the wind pushed against the roof. I chalked it all up to age, to settling, to natural sounds in an old house. At night, though, when I was alone with nothing but the hum of my heater and the occasional gust of wind rattling a window, I started to notice things that didn't quite fit. It started with the shadows. At first, it was just a flicker out of the corner of my eye, something moving too deliberately to be random. I'd see a dark shape against the wall in the hallway, then blink, and it would be gone. I rationalized it as fatigue, stress, and imagination. But then the noises began. Not the normal house noises, but soft footsteps, deliberate and slow, echoing from the attic above my bedroom. At first, I thought it was the wind, then perhaps a raccoon in the rafters. I even went into the attic to check, and of course there was nothing, but the sounds persisted. One night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. My bedroom door was supposed to be closed, and I was alone. I froze, straining my ears. The creak of the door continued, slow and deliberate. I reached for my phone, the small light breaking the darkness, and when I shone it toward the hallway, the door was closed. Completely closed. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to laugh nervously, telling myself I must have dreamed it. Sleep came fitfully after that, interrupted by the occasional creak or bump from elsewhere in the house. Over the next few weeks, the phenomena escalated. It wasn't violent or aggressive. It was subtle, insidious. Items would be moved slightly when I returned to a room. A cup shifted an inch to the left, a book lying open that I had closed, the faint smell of old wood and something else I couldn't identify lingering in the air. Sometimes I'd hear whispers, so faint I couldn't make out the words. I began to feel as if I wasn't truly alone in the house, and the feeling pressed down on me like a weight. I told myself it was normal to feel unsettled in a new place, but deep down I knew it was more than that. One evening, around midnight, I was sitting at my desk, writing. The only light in the room was the warm glow of my lamp. The house was quiet, save for the usual groaning and occasional creaks. Suddenly, I heard the sound of someone breathing behind me. Not the kind of breathing from sleep or wind through the vents. This was deliberate, slow, and wet, as if someone were standing just behind my chair, inhaling heavily. My hand froze over the keyboard. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but the sound continued. I turned slowly. The chair behind me was empty. I spent hours that night sitting rigidly, listening, until the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the blinds. The noises stopped as the sun rose, and the house seemed to exhale along with me. Daylight always brought a sense of relief, a rational explanation for everything. But night always returned the presence, and it grew more insistent. Then came the dreams. They started as ordinary, almost mundane dreams, walking through the house, moving through rooms I knew well. But the dreams grew darker, more vivid. I began to see a figure, a shadowy shape that stood at the end of the hall, watching me. It never moved closer, never spoke, but I felt its attention, heavy and deliberate. I woke from those dreams drenched in sweat, the feeling of eyes on me lingering long after I opened my own. It was in those moments I began to sense the personality behind the presence. Not violent, not overtly malicious, but sad. Heavy with grief, lingering in this world for reasons unknown. One particularly cold night, I was woken by the sound of a woman crying. Soft, muffled, coming from the bedroom I had designated as my office. My apartment had only one bedroom, but the presence of sound suggested another. I got out of bed, stepping lightly over the old floorboards, and followed the sound. It led me to the desk where my papers were neatly stacked. The crying stopped abruptly as I approached, replaced by a weighty silence. I touched the papers, half expecting them to move, and then I felt it. A chill that traveled up my spine, the unmistakable sensation of someone standing directly behind me, leaning over my shoulder. I didn't look. I didn't need to. I whispered, "I hear you. I see you." The air shifted, a soft exhale, almost like a sigh of relief, and the room went quiet. After that, I tried to communicate. I started leaving notes, writing questions on scraps of paper and placing them around the house. Who are you? Why are you here? Do you want me to leave? Some would vanish, some would move slightly, and once I found one folded neatly in half where I hadn't placed it. The responses were subtle, never direct, but they were there. I began to feel that the entity wasn't malevolent. It was trapped, lingering, perhaps unaware of death or unwilling to move on. One night, during a particularly fierce storm, the presence became almost palpable. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and causing the trees to scrape against the house. The lights flickered, and I was working late at my desk, the only illumination from the lamp. I felt it behind me immediately, a heavy presence leaning over the chair, close enough to touch. My body froze, my mind a mixture of fear and fascination. Then I heard it, a whispered voice, clear and deliberate, saying my name. Not a command, not a threat, just my name. Michael, it said. I spun around, but there was no one there. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, echoing the pulse in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, until I felt a cold hand brush against my arm. Not an attack, just contact, light and fleeting. And then it was gone, like a wisp of smoke. I was shaking, heart racing, but there was no lingering anger, no threat, just the sense that I had been acknowledged. After that night, I began to notice other things. Small gestures, subtle signs that the presence wanted me to know it was there. A rocking chair in the corner of the living room, slowly moving though there was no wind. The soft creak of footsteps in the hallway when I was on the phone with friends, asking me if I was okay. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night to find blankets folded neatly on the bed or windows slightly cracked open, as if someone wanted the air to move. I stopped being afraid in the traditional sense. Instead, I felt watched, cared for, and strangely accompanied. Months passed. The sounds, the movements, the presence, it became part of the rhythm of life in the house. I named it in my head, though never out loud. A woman, middle-aged, perhaps long deceased, tied to this house for reasons I would never fully understand. I spoke to her sometimes, whispered into the dark corners of the rooms at night, asking if she was comfortable, if she was at peace, and the house would respond in small ways. A creak, a sigh, a gentle draft. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, I was sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, reflecting on the months behind me. The house was silent, except for the occasional groan of the floorboards. I felt her presence behind me, closer than usual, warm in the strange way that cold and absence can be. I turned slightly and whispered, "You're safe." And in response, the rocking chair in the corner moved for the last time, gently back and forth, then stopped. The house exhaled, quieting in a way that felt complete. I never heard the footsteps again. I never felt the breath on my neck. But I knew she had been there, had lingered long enough to make her presence known, and finally, she had left. In the quiet that followed, I realized I had been part of something I couldn't explain, something that transcended fear. The house was no longer just a home. It was a place where the living and the departed had briefly shared space, where grief and longing had lingered long enough to be acknowledged. And though I slept alone that night and every night afterward, I was not entirely lonely. The memory of her presence, subtle and insistent, lingered like the aftertaste of a dream, a reminder that the world was larger than I could perceive, and that sometimes, even in fear, there was connection. I eventually left the house years later, moving on with my life, carrying the memory with me. I never sought another house like it, never again welcomed the silence that spoke in whispers. But on quiet nights, especially in the fall when the wind shakes the trees and the shadows stretch long and thin, I feel her there again. Not in the violent way the movies depict ghosts, not in the terrifying way stories often warn, but gently, observing, as if to remind me that even those who have passed have their stories, their moments, and sometimes they simply wish to be remembered. Story the end. It was a late September evening when I first arrived at the old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town in upstate New York. I had inherited it from my great-uncle, a man I barely knew, and had decided to spend a few weeks there to sort through his belongings before putting it on the market. The house was isolated, set back from the road by a long gravel driveway lined with towering maples whose leaves were just beginning to turn. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decaying leaves, and as I stepped out of my car, the quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of an old branch swaying in the wind. Inside, the house was dusty and smelled of mildew, with the faint tang of wood smoke lingering in the air as though someone had left a fire burning long ago. I wandered through the room slowly, taking in the creaking floorboards, the faded wallpaper, and the furniture left behind. Heavy, dark pieces, mostly covered in dust cloths. There were photos on the walls, black and white portraits of stern-looking men and women, and children whose eyes seemed to follow me as I moved through the rooms. The first night, I set up in the bedroom on the second floor, a room with a large bay window that overlooked the fields behind the house. I was exhausted from the drive and spent most of the evening unpacking a few essentials, lighting a small fire in the fireplace, and making a simple dinner. Around midnight, I woke suddenly to the sound of someone walking across the floor below. The steps were slow, deliberate, almost like they were pacing. My heart began to race, and I told myself it was probably the old house settling, the floorboards expanding and contracting with the cold night air. I lay back down, trying to ignore the sound, but it continued for nearly an hour, then abruptly stopped. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. Objects I had left on tables or counters would be moved slightly, though no one else was there. Doors that I was certain I had closed would be open in the morning. I found footprints in the dust of the living room floor, bare, small, and childlike, even though I was the only person in the house. One evening, while sitting in the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of a child laughing. I froze. The sound came from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I called out, but there was no answer. The laughter echoed again, soft, almost playful, but there was something in it that made my stomach turn. Determined to rationalize what I was experiencing, I spent the following day researching the house's history. I learned that my great-uncle had bought the property from an elderly couple decades ago. The house had been in the family for generations, and there were rumors of a tragedy involving a young girl who had died there in the 1940s. Her name was barely mentioned in the town records. Mary Ellen, age 7. The details were scarce, but locals whispered about an accident in the barn, and some said she had never really left the house. That night, I slept with the lights on, but the unease persisted. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to the sound of the bedroom door creaking open slowly. I sat up, heart pounding, but no one was there. The air grew icy cold, and I could see my breath fogging in the dim light of the lamp. Then I noticed something at the foot of the bed, a faint, shadowy outline of a small figure. I blinked, and it seemed to move closer, though it made no sound. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, a weight that made it difficult to breathe. I turned on the bedside lamp fully, and the shape vanished instantly. I began documenting everything in a journal, hoping that by writing it down I could make sense of it. But the more I recorded, the more the house seemed to respond. Items would be rearranged in ways I hadn't noticed before, And sometimes, when I reread my notes, I found sentences I hadn't written scrawled in a childish hand. Don't be afraid. Watch. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, I found an old trunk filled with dolls and toys, all coated in thick dust. One doll, in particular, caught my attention. A porcelain figure of a young girl with cracked cheeks and eyes that seemed almost alive. I felt a shiver run down my spine and decided to put the doll in the corner of the room, away from sight. That night I woke to the sound of soft footsteps on the stairs, followed by a tiny voice whispering, "Mary." The doll was no longer in the attic corner. I found it sitting on my bed, staring up at me. I began noticing patterns in the activity. The presence seemed stronger at night, particularly between 2 and 3 a.m. Footsteps, whispers, and fleeting shadows were more frequent. I tried talking to it, asking if it meant harm, but received no response other than the occasional laugh or soft thud of a door closing. I could feel eyes watching me constantly, sometimes from the corners of rooms, sometimes from the shadows cast by the furniture. One evening, as a storm rolled in, I lit the fireplace and tried to read, hoping the sound of the wind and rain would mask the other noises. Around 11 p.m., I heard the distinct sound of a rocking chair moving in the living room. I peeked around the corner and saw a faint, glowing figure of a woman sitting and rocking slowly. Her eyes were hollow, and she looked directly at me. I stumbled back, and she vanished, leaving only the creaking of the empty chair. The following morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the front door to the living room, though it had rained all night and no one had entered the house. On the dining table, a plate of food I hadn't prepared sat waiting, as though someone had eaten breakfast in my absence. I tried to rationalize everything, but deep down, I knew I was not alone. The climax of the haunting came on the 7th night. I had been feeling increasingly exhausted, both physically and mentally, from the constant vigilance. Around 1:30 a.m., I woke to a loud crash from the kitchen. I ran down the stairs and found all the cabinets open, pots and pans scattered across the floor. In the corner stood a small figure, bathed in pale light coming from the storm outside. It was a little girl, soaked and trembling, her eyes wide and dark. She didn't speak at first, only stared. Then she whispered, "Please help me." I froze, unsure of what to do. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but my hands trembled. She moved closer, and I could feel a sudden drop in temperature, a cold so intense it made my skin ache. She reached for my hand, but before I could touch her, she vanished, leaving behind the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The next morning, I found a journal tucked under the kitchen table, pages yellowed and brittle. It belonged to Mary Ellen. The entries were written in careful, childish handwriting, detailing her life in the house, her fear of being left alone, and her sorrow at the accident in the barn. The last entry read, "I am trapped. Please, someone, help me leave." I realized then that the presence was not malevolent. It was desperate, a lost spirit seeking release. I contacted a local historian and a medium, explaining the situation. The medium visited the house, performing rituals and offering prayers. Over the course of several days, the atmosphere changed. The oppressive weight lifted slightly. The footsteps became less frequent, and the whispers faded. Even after the rituals, I could still feel her presence occasionally. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear a soft giggle or see a fleeting shadow. But it was no longer threatening, more like a reminder that she was still there, waiting to be remembered. I stayed in the house for several more weeks, gradually sorting through my great-uncle's belongings, careful to speak kindly and acknowledge the presence around me. When I finally left, the house felt quieter, more at peace. I never saw her again, at least not in full form. But I knew Mary Ellen's spirit remained in the farmhouse, a quiet echo of the life she had lost. Driving away, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that some souls linger not out of malice, but because they are tethered to the world by memory, fear, and unfulfilled wishes. Years later, I sometimes think of that house when I hear the wind whistling through trees or footsteps in an empty room. I tell myself it was all in my head, a combination of isolation and imagination. But I know the truth. I know that some presences are patient, and some memories are so strong that they refuse to fade. The farmhouse still stands, hidden by the trees, waiting quietly for the next visitor to sense what has always been there. I have shared this story only with a few people, and they all smile politely, calling it a ghost story for thrill seekers. I do not laugh. I know that in the quiet moments when the world is still, a little girl waits, watching, remembering, hoping someone will acknowledge her existence. Even now, I sometimes feel a chill in the air when I am alone, a faint whisper of her voice calling my name. And I know, somewhere, the farmhouse is still alive, holding its secrets, and Mary Ellen is still there, patiently waiting for someone to see her, finally, as she always wished. Story the end. I moved to a small town in upstate New York during the early fall. I wasn't looking for anything special, just a quiet place to finish the final semester of my graduate program and maybe take a break from city life. I found a rental house on the outskirts of town, a small two-story structure that had clearly seen better days but had a certain charm. The yard was overgrown, the porch paint peeling, and the shingles on the roof sagged in a few spots, but I was used to older homes, and I liked the privacy it offered. The landlord assured me it had been empty for a few months and that previous tenants had left in a hurry. Nothing serious. The first few nights were quiet, almost unnaturally so. I had Max, my golden retriever, with me, and he spent most of the first evening exploring every corner of the house, sniffing at corners, sniffing the air. At first, I laughed when he hesitated at the top of the stairs, tail tucked slightly, ears perked as if sensing something I couldn't. I brushed it off. Dogs sometimes act strange in new environments. The first odd thing happened on the third night. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a faint noise, almost like whispering. I wasn't entirely sure I was awake at first. It was muffled, distant. But Max bolted upright on the bed, hackles raised, low growl rumbling in his throat. That's when I realized it was real. The whispering was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom door. I tried to call out, my voice shaking. Hello? No response, only the faint sound of breathy murmurs that didn't form words I could understand. I held my breath, clutching the baseball bat I kept under the bed, waiting until the first light of dawn when the whispering stopped abruptly. When I finally ventured into the hallway, there was nothing. No one. No signs of forced entry, the doors all locked the way I had left them. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, sleep deprivation, maybe the house settling. Max, however, refused to sleep in my room for the next several nights. He'd stay at the foot of the stairs, growling at the shadows. By the second week, things escalated. Objects moved. Small things at first. A book on the counter facing the wrong way, a chair slightly askew, but soon larger items. The kitchen cabinets I had firmly closed would be open in the mornings. My keys, left on the table, would be on the counter when I returned from a short errand. I checked for drafts, pets, anything that could account for the movement. Nothing. One night I was sitting in the living room trying to focus on work when I heard what sounded like someone walking upstairs. The steps were deliberate, slow, almost dragging. I froze, listening as they stopped above the hallway. Max growled. I called up, "Who's there?" No answer. My voice sounded weak and absurdly small in the quiet of the house. The steps resumed, fading slowly down the hall and then vanished. I didn't sleep that night. A neighbor eventually told me that the house had a history. Over 100 years old, the place had seen multiple families. One of the stories mentioned a young woman who had died under mysterious circumstances in the upstairs bedroom. According to town lore, some of the previous occupants had complained about feeling watched, hearing footsteps, or waking to the sensation of someone sitting at the edge of the bed. The neighbor said most left quickly. I didn't leave immediately. I tried to coexist, thinking that if I treated the house respectfully and didn't provoke it, perhaps it would leave me alone. That approach did little to help. Nights became filled with soft whispers, objects sliding across floors, and Max barking at nothing, sometimes for hours on end. The shadows seemed darker, heavier, sticking to walls and corners even when lamps were on. Around the third week, during the first major rainstorm of the season, the house reached a level of activity I hadn't imagined. The storm knocked out the power. Candles provided minimal light. I was sitting in the kitchen when I heard the faucet turn on by itself. I ran to shut it off. As soon as I touched the handle, the water stopped. Then came the footsteps, this time coming from the hallway outside the kitchen. They were faster, more urgent, almost like someone pacing back and forth. Max barked frantically, ears pinned, and I stayed rooted, holding the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. I went upstairs to check the bedrooms, flashlight sweeping across the darkened hallway. In the bedroom at the far end, I saw her, a woman in a long dress, pale, hair floating as if underwater. She didn't move toward me, but I could feel her presence, heavy and sorrowful. My heart hammered in my chest. I spoke softly, trying to reassure her, but she remained, watching. I felt an overwhelming sense of despair, as if she were trapped, trying to reach out. Then she disappeared, leaving only the echo of the footsteps. After that night, I knew I couldn't continue living there. I started packing quietly, leaving nothing behind that might provoke or offend. Max stayed close to me, alert and tense. I didn't look back as I left, the house looming silently behind us, still and waiting. Even months later, living in a new apartment, I sometimes hear faint whispers in the night or catch movement in the corner of my eye. I know it's impossible, but I swear I can feel her presence, patient and waiting, still in that house at the edge of town, lost in time and unable to move on. Story the end. I moved to a small town in upstate New York just after finishing college, looking for a quiet place to reset my life. The town itself was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the main street had only 3 restaurants and a single gas station, and where the old houses lined the streets like memories frozen in time. I found a rental on the edge of town, a 2-story farmhouse built in the 1800s. The landlord told me it had been empty for years, but the price was low and the isolation appealed to me. I didn't care much about the stories that came with old houses. I'd grown up hearing ghost tales, and they had always been just that, stories. The first few nights were quiet. The house creaked, sure, but that was normal. The wind whistled through the trees, the radiator groaned, the old wood expanded and contracted. I unpacked, settled in, and for the first time in months, felt like I could breathe. But then, things started to feel slightly off. It began with the sounds, small, faint noises that I couldn't place. A door gently closing upstairs when I was alone on the first floor, footsteps that didn't match mine, a whisper that faded before I could make sense of it. I told myself it was the house settling, my imagination, the wind. It escalated one night about 2 weeks after I moved in. I was asleep when I heard a knocking, slow, deliberate, coming from the front porch. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one had the key. I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear, and then the knocking stopped. I waited until morning, convincing myself it was an animal, maybe a branch hitting the porch. A few nights later, it happened again, this time accompanied by a sound like someone dragging something heavy across the floorboards. I crept downstairs, clutching a baseball bat, but the house was empty. I checked the front door. It was locked. The back door, the windows, everything secure. Yet, something had been in the living room. Something that left faint scratches in the hardwood that hadn't been there before. I decided to set up a small security camera, just to see if it would catch anything. For several nights, it showed nothing unusual. I almost laughed at myself, relieved that maybe it had all been in my head. But then, late one night, the motion sensor on the camera picked up something. The porch light flickered on, revealing a shadowy figure standing just beyond the steps, staring at the door. I could barely make out the shape, tall and thin, face obscured by the shadows. It stayed for minutes, unmoving, and then simply vanished. I watched the footage repeatedly, my stomach twisting each time, but there was no explanation. After that, I couldn't sleep. Every noise became amplified, every shadow a threat. I started keeping the lights on, locking doors and windows even during the day. Yet the figure kept appearing. Not always on the porch, sometimes glimpsed in the reflection of a mirror, at the edge of the kitchen while I cooked, or on the stairs just before I went to bed. Always watching, always silent. Then I found the diary. It was tucked behind a loose floorboard in the attic, brittle and yellowed with age. The handwriting was delicate but hurried, written by a woman named Eleanor who had lived in the house in the late 1800s. Her entries described the same things I had been experiencing. Footsteps in empty rooms, whispers in the dark, shadows that moved without source. She wrote of a presence that seemed to feed on fear, growing stronger the longer she stayed. Eventually, she wrote, she could no longer bear it and fled, never to return. Reading her words, I felt a chill run through me. Everything she described mirrored my experiences exactly. One stormy night, the presence made itself known in a way I couldn't ignore. The wind howled through the trees, rain battered the windows, and the lights flickered violently. I was trying to calm myself with a book when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from the hallway. I froze, realizing the sound was too heavy, too deliberate to be my own. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door, and I could feel the air grow cold. I heard a whisper, faint but distinct, "Leave." I didn't move. My body refused to act, frozen in fear. Then the door handle began to rattle, slowly, methodically, as if testing the lock. I gripped the baseball bat, but my hands shook too badly to hold it properly. The handle twisted once, twice, then stopped. Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove into town, unsure if I would return. But even weeks later, I felt the house's presence in my thoughts. Every time the wind rustled through the city streets or a shadow fell across my apartment floor, I remembered those nights. I remembered the figure standing at the porch, unmoving, waiting. Months passed, and I tried to rebuild my sense of safety. I moved into a small apartment in town, surrounded by people, lights, and noise. Yet sleep eluded me. I kept the television on at night, left lamps burning, and avoided any house that felt empty or isolated. Despite my efforts, I sometimes woke in the middle of the night with the sensation of being watched, the faint sound of footsteps echoing in my mind. Then came the message. One evening, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I opened it to find a single photo, the living room of the farmhouse empty, yet in the corner stood a faint, shadowy figure, head tilted as if observing. Beneath the image, a single word typed in jagged letters, "Still." I deleted the message, blocked the number, but the feeling never left me. Sleep became a constant struggle. Shadows in my apartment seemed to linger longer than they should, and I found myself double-checking locks, watching reflections, and listening to every creak of the old building around me. I never returned to the farmhouse. I couldn't. But even now, years later, when the wind whistles through city streets, when I glimpse a shadow just out of the corner of my eye, I remember that house. I remember the cold, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. And I know that some things do not rest. Some things linger, patient and silent, waiting for the next person to hear the knocks, feel the presence, and understand that they are never truly alone. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear 3 soft, deliberate knocks in my mind, and I know, without doubt, that somewhere that figure is still standing, waiting. Story the end. It was early November when I first arrived in a quiet town near the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. I had accepted a short-term assignment as a substitute teacher and was searching for a place to stay that was both affordable and private. That's when I found the rental. A 2-story farmhouse built in the 1930s, sitting on the edge of a dense, wooded area. The realtor mentioned that the house had been vacant for months, and while structurally sound, it had an aura of being unlived in for quite some time. I didn't think much of it. I had lived alone before and craved the silence that came with isolation. The first night, I noticed the stillness. It wasn't the kind of quiet you find in a bustling city after midnight. This was heavy, almost suffocating. The wind rattled the old windows and the floorboards groaned beneath my steps. I chalked it up to the house settling, reminding myself that it was old and drafty. I tried to sleep, but every groan of the house pulled me awake, and the shadows cast by the porch lights outside made shapes that didn't belong. Within a week, I began noticing oddities. Items moved on their own, but subtly. A notebook I had left on the dining table would be found on the counter. Cups shifted slightly when I returned to the kitchen. At first, I convinced myself it was absent-mindedness. I was tired from the move, adjusting to a new job, but the occurrences were consistent and deliberate. Then came the footsteps. Soft, measured, pacing in the upstairs hallway. I would sit at my desk in the living room, heart pounding, listening. The steps would stop as soon as I moved. I tried climbing the narrow staircase with a flashlight to confront whatever it was, but the rooms were always empty. One night I woke to a soft whisper, so faint that I thought I was dreaming. Then it became clear someone or something was calling my name. Claire. My heart froze. I sat up, eyes wide in the darkness, listening. The room was empty, but I could feel a presence in the air, heavy and patient. I whispered, "Who's there?" And the only reply was a slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards in the hallway. Over the next few weeks, the activity intensified. Doors I had closed were found slightly ajar, shadows flickered at the edges of my vision. Objects shifted subtly, almost teasingly. A pen moved an inch on my desk, a chair rotated slightly, papers repositioned. Nothing violent, nothing overtly threatening, just a presence asserting itself. I began keeping a journal, logging each occurrence, every sound, every movement. Patterns began to emerge. The house had a rhythm that was not entirely random. During one particularly harsh storm, the presence became undeniable. Rain lashed against the windows, wind rattled the siding, and I was working at my desk when I felt the temperature drop sharply behind me. The chair across the room rocked once, slowly, then stopped. I heard soft breathing, not the shallow, anxious kind, but measured, deliberate, close. My hands shook as I held my pen, whispering, "I see you. I know you're here." And the breathing ceased, leaving only the sound of the storm outside. Curiosity compelled me to research the history of the farmhouse. Built in 1931, it had been a private residence for decades. Several occupants had died there, most from natural causes, though one woman named Margaret Hayes had passed in the upstairs bedroom in the 1940s. Local folklore claimed she never truly left, lingering in the home out of loneliness or unfinished business. No official hauntings were reported, but the whispers of locals suggested that the house had a reputation for feeling alive, even when empty. By late November, I began experimenting with communication. I left notes in various rooms. "Are you okay? Or do you want me to leave?" Sometimes the notes remained untouched. Sometimes they were moved, folded, or placed elsewhere. One morning, I found a note on my desk in handwriting I did not recognize. "Lonely." My heart pounded. The message was simple but profound. I realized I was not imagining this presence. It was interacting with me intentionally. Dreams followed. Every night, I found myself walking the house from Margaret's perspective. She moved silently through the rooms, observing, lingering, never speaking. I would see her standing at the window, staring into the woods, radiating a profound sadness. I awoke with the lingering ache of her grief pressing into my chest. Occasionally, I would feel a soft brush on my shoulder, fleeting but unmistakable. By December, the presence had settled into a rhythm that became part of my life. I spoke to her softly at night, leaving small gestures: a candle on the hallway table, a cup of tea on the counter, a note on the dining table. "You are seen, you are acknowledged." The footsteps, whispers, and movements became a quiet dialogue, a pattern I had learned to read. I no longer feared her. Instead, I felt a strange companionship, an unspoken bond. One particularly cold night, sitting by the fireplace, I felt the air shift behind me. A whisper, soft and deliberate, said, "Stay." My breath caught. I responded in a trembling voice, "You're safe. I acknowledge you." The room seemed to exhale. The rocking chair in the corner shifted gently once and then stopped. It was her way of saying goodbye, or at least that she had finally found peace. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances diminished. Footsteps slowed, whispers faded, and objects remained where I placed them. The house returned to near-normal quiet, but the memory of her presence lingered. I realized that some spirits remain not to haunt, but because of unresolved grief or the need to be acknowledged. Fear can be replaced by understanding, recognition, and respect, allowing the living and the departed to coexist peacefully. Even after I moved months later, the memory stayed with me. On quiet nights, when the wind rattles a window or a floorboard creaks, I can still feel her presence. Not threatening, not hostile, but profound. Margaret Hayes became a reminder that the living and the departed can share space, communicate, and find peace through recognition. Some spirits linger simply to be seen, leaving a subtle but lasting imprint on those who acknowledge them. Story the end. It started the summer I moved into an old apartment building in upstate New York. I had just landed a new job teaching at a small college in a quiet town, and I needed a place to stay while I got settled. The building was Victorian and 3 stories tall, with narrow staircases and creaky floors that seemed to protest with every step. I was drawn to it because it was inexpensive, centrally located, and had character: high ceilings, ornate moldings, and tall windows that let in plenty of light. The landlord, an elderly man with thinning hair and a soft voice, seemed eager to rent to someone who would treat the place respectfully. He warned me only about one thing: The building was old, and sometimes it acted up. I laughed it off, assuming he meant the usual creaks and drafts of an aging structure. The first night, I moved in late, exhausted from the drive. The apartment was on the second floor, 2 rooms facing the street, and 1 facing the narrow alley behind. I unpacked quickly, set up my bed, and made a simple dinner. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time, a soft whisper, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. It seemed to come from the bedroom closet, a small space filled with boxes I had yet to unpack. I froze, listening. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I told myself it was the wind moving through the old window frames or maybe a neighbor moving around, and tried to sleep. Over the next few days, I noticed small oddities. Items would be slightly displaced when I returned home. My keys, which I always hung on the hook by the door, would be found on the counter. Small objects seemed to vanish only to reappear in unlikely places. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness or moving things absent-mindedly, but a creeping unease began to settle in. One evening, while cooking, I heard footsteps on the floor above me. The building was old and the floorboards creaked under weight, but the sound was deliberate, slow, methodical steps pacing back and forth. The apartment above me had been vacant for weeks. I froze, holding a knife in my hand, listening as the footsteps moved from one end of the building to the other, then stopped abruptly. I told myself I was imagining it, a trick of the acoustics, but unease gnawed at me. The next night, I lay in bed reading when the whispering returned, clearer this time. "Don't leave," it said. My heart leapt. I sat up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the room. Nothing. The closet door was closed, the boxes undisturbed, the words repeated, soft and insistent, "Don't leave." I felt a chill crawl over my skin. I tried to rationalize it, stress, fatigue, but the feeling of being watched made my chest tighten. I began documenting everything in a journal, noting times, places, and descriptions of the noises and shadows. Sometimes I would hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, though the building was empty. Sometimes I would see shadows moving at the edge of my vision, never clear, always just a flicker. Once I woke to find the bedroom door slightly ajar, even though I was certain I had closed it. One night, around 2 a.m., I awoke to a cold gust of air brushing over my face. I opened my eyes to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall, humanoid, featureless except for its shape. I froze, unable to move. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, only loomed in the darkness. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed. Eventually, it seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving only the feeling of presence, heavy and suffocating. I called the landlord the next day, hesitantly, asking if anyone else had reported unusual experiences. He sighed and told me quietly that the building had a history. "People come and go," he said. "Some feel watched, some hear whispers. We think it's the previous tenants, or something older." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. I felt relief that I wasn't alone in my experiences, but the stories also made me more anxious. That week, I experienced a series of events that escalated my fear. One night, while brushing my teeth, I saw the shadow move across the bathroom mirror. Just a quick flicker, but unmistakably human-shaped. I turned, flashlight trembling in my hand, and found nothing. Another night, I woke to the sound of a woman crying, soft and sorrowful, echoing through the narrow hallways. I searched the apartment, the building, but the sound always seemed to drift just out of reach. I realized I was no longer alone in my own mind. The presence had made itself known, persistent and patient. I began noticing that the noises and shadows followed a pattern, more active at night, peaking between 1 and 3 a.m., fading with daylight. I started sleeping with the bedroom door unlocked, hoping the entity would feel less confined, less threatening. Sometimes the whispers would speak directly to me, "Stay." Other times it would be a sigh, a shuffle, a movement just beyond sight. One evening I decided to explore the apartment above mine, vacant for months, to see if there was any clue to the activity. The landlord reluctantly gave me permission. The apartment was dusty, filled with discarded furniture and peeling wallpaper. In the corner I found an old trunk. Inside were letters and photographs, documenting a family who had lived there decades before. The letters spoke of grief, illness, and sudden deaths. One particularly faded note caught my attention. "We cannot leave. Something keeps us here." I understood then that the presence was tied to the building itself, to the memories and tragedies that had accumulated over decades. It was not malicious, necessarily, but tethered to the space, persistent, patient, longing to be acknowledged. I felt a mix of fear and sorrow for the unseen lives that lingered. The nights that followed were intense. I would awaken to whispers, shadows, and footsteps, but I began speaking to the presence, acknowledging it, offering kindness. I would say, "I see you, I hear you, you are not alone." Slowly, I noticed a change. The footsteps became less frantic, the whispers less urgent. The shadow at the foot of my bed still appeared, but it no longer felt menacing, more like a sentinel, watching, waiting. Months passed. I continued to live in the apartment, learning to coexist with the presence. I never understood why it had made itself known to me, but I accepted that some things exist outside our comprehension. The experience changed me. I became more attuned to silence, to subtle shifts in the environment, to the sense of life lingering in forgotten spaces. Even now, years later, I can feel it when I return to that city. Walking past the old building, I sense the weight of memories held within its walls. The whispers and footsteps no longer haunt me, but a quiet presence lingers, patient, waiting for acknowledgement. I have learned that some spirits do not vanish. They remain, tethered to the places they knew, observing, hoping someone will notice, hoping someone will remember. I never tell the full story to anyone. Most people would laugh, call it a ghost story, or an overactive imagination. I do not laugh. I know the truth. I know that some presences are patient enough to wait for decades, to follow you quietly, to watch as you move through the world, and to remind you that there are forces beyond our understanding. Sometimes late at night, when I am alone in my own home, I feel a slight chill in the air, hear a faint whisper, or catch a shadow moving just beyond my sight. I do not turn. I do not run. I simply acknowledge it. I have learned that acknowledgement is the only form of respect it seeks. Some presences are patient, some are tethered, and some never leave. I sleep with lights on, doors locked, and a quiet awareness that the world is larger and older than I had ever imagined. The apartment building still stands, filled with memories and shadows, holding within it the stories of those who came before. And somewhere, quietly, a presence waits, patient, observing, persistent. It does not harm. It does not hurry. It simply exists, reminding anyone who will listen that the past is never truly gone, and that some things linger long after life has ended. Story, the end. I had just moved into that little rental house on the outskirts of town in early October, right when the nights were starting to get colder and the days seemed to shrink faster than I was ready for. The house sat alone at the end of a cracked asphalt driveway, surrounded by tall oaks and maples that creaked when the wind hit them right. From the pictures online, it looked quaint. A cozy one-story with a wraparound porch, the kind of place you'd imagine sipping coffee on in the mornings while deer wandered through the yard. In person, though, the place had a different feel. It wasn't bad exactly, just still, like the air inside never moved. Even on breezy days, it felt heavier in the house than it should have. I wrote it off as me overthinking things. I've always had an active imagination, and I figured I was just adjusting to living on my own again after years of roommates. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, got my work schedule settled, and spent most evenings sitting on that porch, listening to the crickets. I'd brought my dog, Max, with me, a 3-year-old golden retriever who usually loved every new place and person he met. But from the moment we walked in, he was on edge. His tail would stiffen and his ears would perk whenever we were in the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The first night, he wouldn't even sleep in my room, which was unusual because he'd been glued to me since the day I adopted him. Instead, he sat in the doorway of the bedroom, staring into the dark hallway until he finally laid down with a soft, low whine. By the second week, I started noticing small things that didn't make sense. I'd leave my keys on the counter by the sink, but when I went to grab them before work, they'd be sitting on the coffee table. A cabinet door in the kitchen that I swore I'd closed would be cracked open the next morning. Nothing alarming. Things that were easy to dismiss as me being forgetful or still getting used to where I'd been setting things down. It wasn't until the third week that the nights got strange. I'd been having trouble sleeping. I'd toss and turn until well after midnight, the house so quiet it made my own heartbeat sound too loud. Then, one night, I woke up around 3:15 in the morning. At first, I didn't know what had woken me, but then I heard it, soft footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Max sat up immediately, ears up, head pointed toward the door, a low growl starting deep in his throat. I froze in bed, straining to listen. The steps were slow, almost dragging, and stopped right outside my door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice rough. Silence. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and waited. Max stayed rigid at the edge of the mattress, staring at the door, a faint tremor running through his body. I didn't move until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the blinds. When I finally worked up the nerve to check, the hallway was empty. The front and back doors were locked, exactly the way I'd left them. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Sleep paralysis, maybe. That made sense, and it was easier to believe than the alternative. But then it happened again 2 nights later. This time I was awake, scrolling mindlessly through my phone in bed, when I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slower, heavier, like someone dragging their feet along the wooden floorboards. Max growled again, this deep, guttural sound I'd never heard from him before. My mouth went dry as the footsteps stopped right outside my room again. The doorknob rattled, just faintly, but enough to make my skin crawl. I sat there frozen, barely breathing, until the sound faded away, step by step, down the hallway. I didn't sleep at all that night. I told myself the house was settling, that old wood made noises, that maybe I had raccoons in the attic or walls. That weekend, I even had a pest control guy come out, but he didn't find anything. No droppings, no signs of animals. He joked that maybe the place was haunted. I laughed, but it came out shaky. Things escalated from there. Objects started moving in ways I couldn't explain. I'd come home from work and find picture frames turned face down on shelves, or the bathroom mirror fogged up, even though I hadn't showered. One night, I woke up to the sound of the kitchen faucet running full blast. I walked in to turn it off, and as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, the water shut off on its own. I started leaving lights on at night. It didn't help much. The shadows in the house felt thicker somehow, like they clung to the walls and corners even when the lamps were on. Max stopped going down the hallway altogether. He'd sleep in the living room now, whining softly when I called him into the bedroom. It was like he sensed something I couldn't see. The worst night came in early November, during the first big storm of the season. The rain was relentless, pounding against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees like something alive. The power went out around midnight, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and tried to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps, but faster this time, urgent, coming straight down the hallway toward my bedroom. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the bat, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Max barked, this sharp, panicked sound before darting behind me. The footsteps stopped at my door, and then, clear as day, a whisper, right at the edge of the door frame. "Get out." I dropped the bat. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick it up again. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, until the first light of dawn crept in through the blinds. The next morning I started packing. I didn't care about the lease, or that breaking it would cost me 2 months' rent. I called the landlord, mumbled something about a family emergency, and by that afternoon, I was hauling boxes into my car. When I went back for the last load, the house felt different, colder. The air was so heavy it felt like I was breathing through wet cloth. As I carried the final box to the car, I swear I heard footsteps following me down the hall one last time. Slow, deliberate. I didn't look back. I stayed with a friend for a week before finding a new place. It's been months now, but some nights when I'm lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I swear I hear it again, that slow drag of footsteps in the hallway, just outside my door. Story the end. It started the summer. I decided to take a solo road trip across the Midwest. I had just finished a hectic semester teaching at a community college in Ohio, and I needed a break, some time to myself, away from the constant noise of students, grading, and city life. My plan was simple. Drive west, stop at small towns along the way, camp in state parks, and see where the road took me. I had a beat-up Ford with more miles than I cared to count, a tent, a sleeping bag, and a vague sense of adventure. I didn't expect anything unusual, certainly not what I encountered. The first few days were uneventful, picturesque even. I drove through cornfields that stretched endlessly, past small towns with faded signs advertising diners and antique shops. At night, I set up camp near rivers or forested areas, enjoying the quiet, the stars stretching across the sky like spilled silver. I told myself I liked the solitude. I thought I was prepared for it. It was on the fourth night, somewhere near rural Indiana, that things started to feel off. I had stopped at a state park after driving all afternoon. The campground was nearly empty. A few families had tents set up near the lake, but I chose a secluded site along a narrow dirt road. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and cooked some dinner. The sun had just dipped behind the trees, and the air was cool and still. I remember feeling a strange weight in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Around 11 p.m., I heard it for the first time, a voice, faint, almost like a whisper, carried on the wind. I paused, listening. It wasn't words I could understand, just a low, mournful sound, rising and falling in pitch. I assumed it was an animal, maybe a coyote or an owl, and shook my head. But then I heard footsteps, not in the leaves, not on the dirt road, but right outside my tent. Slow, deliberate pacing. My stomach tightened. I unzipped the tent carefully, peering into the darkness. Nothing. Just shadows, trees swaying gently in the breeze. I told myself it was my imagination, the way isolation plays tricks on the mind. I crawled back into my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing heart. But the footsteps continued, circling the tent, stopping, then resuming. I held my breath, listening, until exhaustion finally overtook fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I found small disturbances near my campsite, twigs broken unnaturally, small footprints in the soft earth, and my fire pit disturbed, though I was sure I had extinguished everything before bed. I considered moving on, but a part of me wanted to see the place in daylight, to reassure myself that nothing had happened. That day, I explored a nearby trail, following it through dense woods and over small creeks. About a mile in, I stumbled across a small, abandoned cabin. The wood was rotting, the roof partially collapsed, and windows caked with dust and grime. It looked untouched for decades. A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity pushed me closer. Inside, the air was thick with decay. The floor sagged in places, and cobwebs draped the corners like tattered curtains. On the wall, a faded photograph of a family stared back at me. A man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were somber, and there was something in their eyes that made my skin crawl. I didn't stay long. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. A soft whisper, unmistakably human, though the words were gone. My head snapped toward the sound, but the cabin was empty. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks after hours of hiking in silence. I left the cabin and returned to my car, eager to get back to civilization. That night, I decided to camp in a more populated area near a group of RVs parked along a lake. I thought the presence from the previous night would not follow me, that perhaps it had been tied to the abandoned cabin. But as I lay in my tent, I heard it again. Footsteps outside, circling, then stopping. I heard the whispering voice, soft, almost sorrowful. I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight around, but the trees were empty, the lake calm and still. I sat up all night, flashlight in hand, listening to the faint sounds that I could not explain. Over the next several days, the occurrences grew more persistent. I began hearing whispers while driving, so faint I questioned whether I was imagining them. Sometimes I would see shadows flit across the road at the edge of my headlights, human shapes, tall, thin, moving against the grain of the trees. I tried talking to myself to dismiss it, rational explanations about animals, wind, and fatigue, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. On the 7th night, I stopped at a small town in Missouri, seeking a motel instead of camping. I was exhausted, and the idea of a real bed and a shower was irresistible. The motel was old, a single story, with flickering neon lights that cast red reflections across the parking lot. The desk clerk was polite but distant, eyes wary as if they had seen too much. The room itself was functional, though dated. I showered, made a sandwich, and tried to sleep. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of soft scratching at the window. I froze. The room was on the ground floor, and outside the window was just the blackness of the parking lot. I grabbed my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The scratching grew louder, moving across the glass in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Then I heard a voice, barely audible, "Don't leave." My heart hammered. I told myself it was a dream, that my mind was inventing these horrors, but the sound persisted. I switched on the lamp and froze. There, on the bed beside me, sat a figure. A man, hunched, wearing a suit that looked decades old. His face was pale, with deep, hollow eyes, and he stared at me without blinking. I couldn't move. The figure spoke again softly, almost pleading, "Stay." I bolted upright, but the figure had vanished. The room was silent, empty, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I slept fitfully the rest of the night, hearing footsteps pacing the motel room, whispers that called my name, and the occasional cold draft that brushed over my skin. By the next morning, I had decided to cut my trip short. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had latched onto me during the journey, following me from place to place. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue and imagination, but the memories of the whispers, the shadows, and the figure in the motel room haunted me, even as I drove back east. Over the following weeks, I noticed signs that I couldn't explain. Objects in my apartment would move slightly, lights would flicker when no one was home, and sometimes in the quiet of night I would hear soft footsteps pacing outside my bedroom door. I would wake in a cold sweat, convinced I had left the window open, though it was always shut. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of a room, vanishing when I turned toward it. I began researching haunted locations in the Midwest, trying to see if other travelers had experienced something similar. There were stories, countless accounts of people feeling watched, hearing whispers, or seeing figures in abandoned buildings, forests, and rural roads. It seemed the presence I had encountered was not unique, but part of something larger, something patient, lurking, waiting for people to wander into its territory. I learned that in many of the towns I had passed through, there had been disappearances over the decades, people vanishing along rural roads, in forests near abandoned buildings. Locals whispered of spirits, lingering energies, and entities tied to old tragedies. Some said they were drawn to isolation, to travelers who ventured too far from populated areas. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that fear exaggerates perception, that isolation and fatigue play tricks on the mind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, heard, and felt was real. The presence had followed me in some form, tethered to the very act of traveling, to my solitude, to my willingness to wander into places untouched by casual visitors. Years have passed since that summer, yet the memories remain vivid. I still travel occasionally, but I avoid rural backroads, abandoned buildings, and quiet forests. Sometimes late at night, when I am alone, I hear the faint echo of a whisper, a subtle footstep, or feel a cold draft brush over me. It is never threatening anymore, but it is always present, a reminder that there are things in this world that do not rest, that watch, and that wait patiently for someone to notice. I have shared the story only with a few close friends, who smile politely and call it a ghost story. I do not laugh. I know the truth. There are presences that follow, shadows that linger, and whispers that persist long after the traveler has left. I have learned to respect the silence, the empty roads, the abandoned places. Some things are patient, patient enough to follow, patient enough to wait for decades, and I now understand that once noticed, they never truly leave. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see the figure in the motel room, the man in the suit, hollow-eyed and waiting. I can hear the faint whispers along the gravel roads of Indiana, the soft laughter near abandoned cabins in Missouri. I know that the Midwest holds secrets, shadows that have been there long before me, and will remain long after. I sleep with lights on, doors locked, and a small measure of comfort that comes from acknowledging the presence rather than denying it. Some nights, the whispers return, soft and patient. I do not turn to face them. I do not run. I lie still, breathing slowly, and wait. Because I have learned that some encounters do not end. They follow, quietly, observing, and reminding me that the world is larger and older than I ever imagined, and that solitude sometimes comes with a price no one warns you about. Story the end. I had never been one to believe in ghosts. I'd watch the shows when they were on, laugh at people running down dark hallways because of a shadow, and roll my eyes whenever a friend insisted their grandma's house was haunted. But there are some things that happen in life that you can't shrug off, no matter how much you try to explain them away. This happened 5 years ago in a little town in northern Pennsylvania. I had just gotten out of a rough relationship and needed a change. My job allowed me to work remotely, and I wanted somewhere quiet where I could clear my head. I found a small house online, a two-bedroom place that had been on the market for a while, sitting just on the edge of town where the woods started. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously cheap, but the pictures made it look cozy. A white porch, a little garden out front, and big windows that let in a ton of light. I signed the lease over the phone, packed up my car, and drove up a few days later. The house was older than it looked in the photos, the paint peeling a bit on the porch, and the yard overgrown, but I brushed it off. The landlord, a quiet older man named Gary, met me there with the keys. He didn't say much, just handed them over and told me to call if anything broke. When I asked why the rent was so low, he paused for a second, then said something about the market in town being slow before quickly changing the subject. I should have paid more attention to that. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, bought some groceries, and spent my evenings sitting on the porch with a book, listening to the crickets and the occasional car on the highway in the distance. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made me feel like I had made the right decision. But then little things started to happen. It started with noises. At night, after I'd turned off the lights, I'd hear what sounded like footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking from the kitchen to the living room. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling or maybe animals in the walls. Old houses make noises all the time, right? Then, a few nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of the front door creaking open. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, so I couldn't see the door from my bed, but I could hear the hinge groan as it swung. My heart started pounding. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd kept next to the bed since moving in and slowly made my way down the hall, every floorboard under my feet groaning. When I got to the front door, it was shut tight, locked, just like I'd left it. I tried to brush it off. I told myself I'd imagined it, maybe dreamed it. But after that, sleep didn't come as easily. I started leaving a light on in the living room, just a small lamp, so the house wouldn't feel so dark at night. One afternoon, maybe a week after that, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a soft tapping on the window above the sink. It startled me because my yard backed up to woods, and there wasn't anyone who should have been out there. I looked up, expecting maybe a bird or a branch in the wind, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently. Then, just as I turned to go back to the coffee, the tapping came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the glass. I froze, my stomach dropping. There was no one there. After that, things escalated. I'd leave the house to run errands and come back to find cabinet doors standing wide open in the kitchen. Once, I left my keys on the coffee table, went to take a shower, and when I came back out, they were sitting neatly in the middle of my bed. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked, though I didn't know what that would have done if someone, or something, really wanted to get in. One night, around 3 a.m, I woke up to the sound of humming. It was faint at first, so soft I thought maybe I was still dreaming. But as I sat there, straining to hear, it got louder. It was a woman's voice, low and melodic, humming some kind of lullaby I didn't recognize. It was coming from the living room. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. I sat there in bed, clutching my phone, debating whether to call the police, but what would I even say? That a ghost was humming in my house? Eventually, the humming stopped, just as suddenly as it started. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I called Gary. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I told him I thought maybe someone had broken in, that I was hearing noises at night and things were being moved around. He was quiet for a long moment before finally saying, "That house, it's old. Been there since the 50s. You're not the first tenant to notice things." When I pressed him for more, he just said, "If it gets to be too much, I'll let you out of your lease," and hung up. That was when I started doing some digging. I went to the library in town, flipped through old newspapers, and found a story from the early 80s. A woman named Margaret and her young daughter, Emily, had lived in the house. One night, Margaret's husband came home drunk, and there had been an argument. Neighbors reported hearing shouting, then nothing. The next morning, the husband was gone, and both Margaret and Emily were found dead inside. The article didn't give details, just said it was a domestic tragedy. I sat there in the library, staring at the grainy black and white photo of the house I was now living in, and felt my stomach turn. After that, the activity got worse. I'd be sitting at my desk, working, and hear the soft pitter-patter of little feet running down the hallway. But when I turned, the hall would be empty. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering right outside my bedroom door. It was faint, too quiet to make out words, but I could feel the presence of someone standing there on the other side, just waiting. I started keeping my phone next to me all the time, camera ready, but no matter how fast I moved, I never caught anything. The scariest night came at the end of my second month in the house. There was a storm rolling in, the wind howling through the trees, rain pelting against the windows. The power went out around 11, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a couple candles and sat in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard the humming again. This time, it was louder, clearer. And it wasn't just humming. There were words, though I couldn't make them out. It sounded like it was coming from the kitchen. I sat frozen, the book slipping from my hands as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. My breath came out in white puffs, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow darting across the hallway. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and called out, "Who's there?" My voice was shaking, my hands trembling so hard I could barely hold the phone steady. There was no answer. Just the creak of the floorboards, slow, deliberate steps moving toward me from the kitchen. I bolted. I ran out the front door, barefoot in the rain, and didn't stop until I reached my car. I sat there, soaked and shaking, until the storm passed and the first hints of morning light broke through the clouds. When I finally went back inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The candles had burned down to stubs, the book still lying open on the couch. But on the wall in the hallway, written in the condensation from the storm, were 2 words: "Get out." I called Gary that morning and told him I was done. He didn't argue. By the end of the week, I was gone. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that house, about the humming, about the feeling of being watched every second of every day I spent there. I don't know who or what was in that house, but I know this. When the night is quiet and the wind is just right, sometimes I swear I can still hear that soft, haunting lullaby in the distance. Story the end. It was a cold October afternoon when I first arrived in the small town of Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania. I had taken a temporary position teaching at the local community college, and I needed a place to stay for the few months I would be there. The house I rented was a modest 2-story Victorian on the outskirts of town, perched at the edge of a dense wood. Built in the early 1900s, it had the kind of worn charm that drew me in immediately. Creaking floorboards, ornate woodwork, and large windows that overlooked the trees behind the property. The realtor mentioned, almost reluctantly, that the house had been empty for nearly a year and that the previous tenant had left suddenly, refusing to explain why. I shrugged it off. The price was right, and I needed quiet. The first night, I noticed the stillness. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a secluded countryside. It was heavy, almost suffocating. The wind rattled the window panes, and the old floors groaned under my own footsteps. I told myself it was just the house settling, that old houses have quirks, but sleep did not come easily. Every creak and groan made my heart jump. Every shadow in the corner of my eye seemed alive. Within a few days, I began noticing subtle disturbances. Objects moved, but only slightly, enough to make me question whether I had left them where they were. A coffee cup would be found on the windowsill when I was certain I had left it on the counter. A notebook I placed on the dining table ended up on the couch. I tried to rationalize, blaming fatigue or absent-mindedness, but the frequency was troubling. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate pacing along the hallway upstairs. My heart would pound, and I would sit frozen at the bottom of the stairs, listening. As soon as I moved, the steps would stop. When I ventured upstairs, flashlight in hand, the rooms were empty. No signs of forced entry, nothing broken, just evidence of a presence. One night around midnight, I woke to a whisper. Faint at first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows, but then I heard it clearly. My name, drawn out slowly, Claire. My heart froze. I sat up, eyes wide in the darkness, listening. The room was empty, but the presence was undeniable. I whispered, "Who's there?" And the only response was the slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard in the hallway. Over the next few weeks, the activity intensified. Doors I had closed would be found slightly ajar. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision. Objects shifted subtly. A pen moved an inch on my desk, a chair rotated slightly, a newspaper folded differently than I left it. Nothing violent, nothing overtly threatening, just a quiet insistence that the house was not empty. I began keeping a journal, meticulously noting each occurrence. Footsteps, whispers, objects moved, lights flickering. Patterns began to emerge. The house had a rhythm, a presence with its own timing. During one particularly harsh storm in early November, the presence became almost tangible. Rain lashed against the windows, wind rattled the siding, and I was at my desk when the air grew suddenly colder. The chair across the room rocked gently, as though someone had just risen and sat down again. I heard soft, steady breathing, deliberate and close. My hands shook as I whispered, "I see you. I know you're here." The breathing ceased, leaving only the sound of the storm outside. I realized then that this was not a hostile presence. It was aware of me, observing, waiting. Curiosity drove me to research the history of the house. Built in 1902, it had been a private residence for decades. Several occupants had died there, mostly from natural causes. One woman, Margaret Hayes, had lived there in the 1940s and passed away alone in the upstairs bedroom. Local folklore suggested she lingered, tied to the house by grief or unfinished matters. No official hauntings were recorded, but whispers from townspeople hinted at unusual occurrences in the house when it stood vacant. By mid-November, I began leaving notes around the house. Simple questions like, "Are you okay?" or "Do you want me to leave?" Sometimes the notes remained untouched, other times they were moved or folded differently, sometimes appearing in new locations. One morning, I found a note on my desk with a single word written in delicate script, "Lonely." My heart pounded. The presence was communicating intentionally, seeking acknowledgement. Dreams followed. Night after night, I found myself moving through the house from Margaret's perspective, silent and observant. She never spoke, but her presence was palpable. I would wake with a lingering ache, a deep sense of her sadness pressing into my chest. Occasionally, I would feel a soft brush on my shoulder, fleeting but unmistakable, as if she were reminding me she was there. By late November, the presence had settled into a rhythm that became part of my life. I spoke to her softly at night, left candles on tables, small cups of tea, notes saying, "You are seen, you are acknowledged." The footsteps, whispers, and object movements became a quiet dialogue, a pattern I had learned to read. I no longer feared her. Instead, there was companionship, an unspoken bond that existed between the living and the lingering spirit. One particularly cold night, sitting by the fireplace, I felt the air shift behind me. A whisper, soft and deliberate, said, "Stay." My breath caught, and I whispered back, "You're safe. I acknowledge you." The room seemed to exhale. The rocking chair in the corner shifted once, gently, then stopped. It felt like a farewell, a sign that Margaret had finally found peace. In the weeks that followed, the disturbances diminished. Footsteps slowed, whispers faded, and objects remained where I placed them. The house returned to a quiet, normal rhythm, yet the memory of her presence lingered. I realized that some spirits linger not to frighten, but because of loneliness, grief, or a need to be recognized. Fear can be replaced by understanding, acknowledgement, and respect, allowing the living and the departed to coexist peacefully. Even after I moved months later, the memory stayed. On quiet nights, when the wind rattles a window or a floorboard creaks unexpectedly, I still feel her presence. Not threatening, not hostile, but profound. Margaret Hayes' spirit remains a reminder that the living and the departed can share space, communicate, and find peace through recognition. Some spirits linger simply to be seen, leaving subtle but lasting imprints on those who take the time to notice them. Story the end. It started with the sound of wind whistling through the trees, that soft, hollow whistle that makes you second guess whether it's really just the weather or something else entirely. I had been living in that small house in northern Pennsylvania for just over a month when the first strange thing happened. The house itself wasn't much. 1 story, 2 bedrooms, a porch that leaned slightly to the left, and a yard full of pine needles that never seemed to go away no matter how often I raked. It had been empty for nearly 5 years before I signed the lease. I didn't think much of it at the time. In towns like this, places sat empty all the time because there wasn't much to keep people here anymore. I'd moved in for the quiet, away from the constant hum of the city. I'd been burning out fast. Long hours at work, no time for myself, constant traffic, sirens at night. So when I found the listing online, a tiny house for cheap rent with a yard and no immediate neighbors, it felt like the universe was telling me to just go. The first few weeks were peaceful, almost too quiet, but I told myself that was exactly what I needed. I filled the silence with music or the faint hum of podcasts while I unpacked. The first time I heard it, I told myself it was nothing. It was about 2 a.m, and I'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The wind had been restless all night, slapping against the thin walls and making the old window panes rattle. Then, underneath it, I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully so the boards wouldn't creak too loud. My body went cold. I lay there frozen, holding my breath and straining to hear more. The porch light wasn't on, and I hadn't installed any cameras yet. My phone was on the nightstand, screen lighting up my hand as I gripped it, debating whether to call someone or just look outside. After a minute or so, the steps stopped. I didn't move for the rest of the night, barely blinked, and when morning finally came, I told myself it had to have been an animal. A raccoon, maybe. The woods stretched out just past my backyard. Deer, foxes, raccoons, even bears sometimes came through. For a while, nothing else happened. Days blurred together with the same routine. Coffee in the morning, long walks around the property, reading on the porch at night. The quiet started to feel normal, even comforting. But one evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the trees in that deep orange glow, I saw something move along the tree line. It was quick, too quick for me to catch a clear look, but I could swear it was a person. Tall, thin, wearing something pale. My stomach tightened as I scanned the edge of the woods, but there was nothing there when I squinted into the shadows. I laughed it off at first. I'd been jumpy since that night with the footsteps, and being alone in an isolated place can play tricks on you. But the unease stayed with me. That night, the footsteps came back. Same time, just after 2 a.m. This time it was louder, clearer. Someone, or something, walked up the porch steps and paused right by the front door. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, the thin curtains swaying with the draft from the open window. My throat was dry as I whispered, "Hello?" into the empty room. No response, just silence, thick and pressing. Then the footsteps retreated, slow and steady, until they faded away. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed in bed, every muscle tense, staring at the ceiling until the first light of dawn broke through. I tried to rationalize it again. Maybe someone got lost in the woods. Maybe it was just a kid messing around. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong with that house. I started locking the door every night, just double-checking it before bed. I installed a motion light above the porch and ordered a cheap camera that I set up facing the front yard. For a few days, it seemed to work. No more footsteps, no strange noises, just quiet. Then one morning, I checked the camera footage and my stomach dropped. Around 2:12 a.m., the camera caught the motion light flicking on, flooding the porch in a harsh white glow. And standing just beyond its reach, at the edge of the yard, was a figure. Tall, thin, unmoving. It didn't come closer, didn't move at all. The figure just stood there, its face obscured by shadows, for almost 3 minutes before the light turned off and the recording ended. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. My hands shook as I rewound the footage again and again, but it never got clearer. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, young or old, just that it was there, watching. I sent the footage to a friend in the city, half joking when I texted, "Think I need to move already?" But she didn't find it funny. She called me right away, her voice sharp with worry. "You need to leave, seriously. That's not normal." I didn't listen. I told myself it was some random drifter, maybe a hunter passing through. I didn't want to believe it was anything more. But that night, the footsteps came back, louder than ever, circling the porch. I sat in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife, listening as whoever it was walked slowly around the house, their steps crunching against the gravel and dry pine needles. Then came the tapping, light, deliberate, against the glass of the living room window. I couldn't move. My skin crawled as I sat frozen on the couch, staring toward the sound. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence swallowed the house again, but I didn't sleep until the sun was up. The next morning, I found handprints on the glass. Faint, but they're long, narrow smudges higher than my own reach. I scrubbed the glass clean, trying not to think about how cold the prints felt against my fingers. By the third week, I was unraveling. I barely slept, jumping at every creak of the house, every rustle in the trees. The camera kept catching strange flashes, glimpses of that figure at the edge of the yard, always standing just far enough away to blur into the shadows. Once it was closer. Right at the bottom of the porch steps, still and silent as the light bathed it in white. Its head was tilted, like it was listening. I showed the footage to my landlord, but he just shook his head and muttered something about old stories people used to tell about the property, about how nobody stayed there long. He wouldn't say more, no matter how much I pressed. By then, I had started locking every window, keeping the lights on even when I slept. But it didn't matter. Whatever it was, it wanted in. The storm came a few nights later, a heavy downpour that shook the house and sent branches slapping against the siding. I thought maybe the rain would keep it away, maybe the storm would drown out the quiet that seemed to draw it in. But sometime after 2, I woke up to the sound of the front door handle rattling, slow at first, then harder, more insistent. I stumbled out of bed, my breath catching in my throat as the handle jerked and twisted, metal scraping against metal. I whispered, "Go away," but the words barely made a sound. Then, as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. I stood there in the dark, my hand gripping the edge of the hallway wall, when I heard it. Footsteps inside. Not on the porch this time. Inside. Slow, dragging footsteps moving from the front door toward the living room. I don't remember how long I stood frozen, my ears ringing, my body refusing to move. But eventually, I forced myself to step forward, gripping the knife in my hand so tightly it left marks in my skin. The living room was empty. The kitchen, too. Every door was locked, every window shut. But I could feel it. Like someone had been there. Like the air itself had shifted. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my bedroom, knees drawn up to my chest, eyes on the door until the sun finally rose. That morning, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the lease, didn't care that I had nowhere else to go. I drove away with the motion camera still on, still recording. 2 days later, I got an alert that the camera had picked up movement. Against my better judgment, I opened the app. The porch light was flickering, on and off, casting sharp, stuttering shadows across the front yard. And there at the bottom of the porch steps stood the figure, closer than it had ever been, its head tilted up toward the camera, its face still hidden in darkness. And then slowly it raised a hand and pressed it against the lens until the feed went black. Story the end. It started on a cool September evening when I first arrived at the small lakeside cabin I had rented in upstate New York. The sky was streaked with shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the tree line, and the air had that crisp bite that hinted at autumn. I was looking for solitude, a few weeks away from city life to finish my manuscript. The cabin itself was older, built in the 1940s, with wooden floors that creaked under even the lightest step and windows that rattled when the wind gusted. There was something comforting about its age and rustic charm, but also something vaguely unsettling, as if the walls held memories that were eager to whisper them. The first night was ordinary. I unpacked my things, made a simple dinner, and settled into the living room with a cup of tea. The quiet was profound, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside or the distant honk of a bird. But as I prepared for bed, I realized the silence was not just absence. It felt heavy, like the air itself was listening. I dismissed it as imagination and fatigue. It was around midnight that I first noticed the sound. A soft tapping, rhythmic, coming from the attic above the cabin. I froze, straining to listen. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, almost like someone walking carefully across the floorboards. I tried to rationalize it. It could be the wind, an animal, settling wood, but the cadence felt unnatural. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air was cool and smelled of dust and old wood. There was nothing there. Nothing except the faint imprint of damp footprints in the dust, as if someone had walked across the floor. I frowned, shaking my head, telling myself I must be seeing things. The next few nights were a mixture of unease and rationalization. The sounds persisted, tapping, soft footsteps, occasional thuds that echoed through the empty house. I began to notice small things out of place. My coffee mug moved slightly, a chair turned at an odd angle, papers shifted on the table. One morning, I found my notebook open to a page I didn't remember writing on, with a single line in neat, looping handwriting, "I see you." I tried to dismiss it. Perhaps I had sleepwalked, or my subconscious had written it without my remembering. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. At night, the cabin seemed alive, the shadows long and deliberate. I began keeping a journal, noting the times the sounds occurred, what I was doing, and any unusual sensations. That night, the journal itself seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I'd place it on the desk, and the next morning it would be on the bed, pages slightly bent, open to the middle. One night, as a storm raged outside, I was woken by the distinct sound of crying. Low, mournful, echoing through the walls. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. The sound seemed to come from the kitchen, though I was alone. I turned on every light and went to investigate. Nothing. Just the wind howling through the cracks in the window frames. Yet the crying didn't feel imaginary. It carried emotion, grief, a deep sadness that pressed against the ribs like a physical weight. I tried speaking aloud, asking if anyone was there. The crying ceased instantly, replaced by a sudden, eerie silence. The following day, I explored the surrounding area, hoping to distract myself from the unsettling presence in the cabin. There was a small dock by the lake, a forest trail, and an old, overgrown cemetery a short walk away. The cemetery was mostly abandoned, the gravestones leaning, moss-covered, names nearly illegible. One stone caught my eye. Margaret Hensley, 1942. I noted the date mentally, feeling an odd sense of familiarity, though I didn't know why. I shrugged it off and returned to the cabin, determined to convince myself there was nothing paranormal at play. That night, as the storm raged, the events escalated. I was working at my desk when a shadow passed across the room. The lamp flickered, then went out, leaving me in near darkness. I fumbled for a flashlight and turned it toward the shadow, but nothing was there. Then I heard the whisper, soft but distinct, my name, repeated 3 times. Ethan, Ethan, Ethan. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't told anyone my name since arriving at the cabin. The rental company had handled the key exchange. My skin prickled, and I felt a cold weight settle on the back of my neck. I left the cabin briefly, stepping into the rain, trying to shake off the growing fear. But when I returned, things had changed. My personal items were moved more dramatically. Books stacked in odd piles, the couch cushions arranged in a way I hadn't placed them, and the window blinds slightly ajar despite my remembering closing them. It felt deliberate. Not malicious, but intentional. Someone or something was aware of me, observing my patterns, and perhaps testing me. Sleep became almost impossible. Every creak, tap, or sigh of wind felt amplified. I started setting small cameras around the cabin, hoping for evidence, but reviewing the footage yielded nothing concrete. Just shadows, dust motes, and occasional flickers of light that seemed unnatural. One night, I awoke to the feeling of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. I could feel the weight, the pressure of a presence, but saw nothing when I turned on the lamp. I whispered, "I see you," and the pressure lifted immediately. The sensation of being acknowledged, of being seen, was oddly comforting, though it didn't erase the fear entirely. I began trying to communicate more directly. I wrote questions on slips of paper. Who are you? Why are you here? Do you want me to leave? I left them in various places. Sometimes they would vanish, sometimes they would move slightly. One morning, I found a response, a single word written in a delicate hand. Alone. It struck me, a chill running down my spine. Alone. That was all it needed to say. Alone and waiting, tethered to this world, unseen but watching. Over the following weeks, the presence grew more interactive. The rocking chair in the corner would move gently, the floorboards creaked under unseen footsteps, and the whispering voice became clearer. Occasionally, it spoke in short phrases. Stay. Don't leave. Remember me. I began leaving small gestures, offering warmth and acknowledgement. I would speak softly at night, leave a candle lit, and keep the cabin tidy. It was as if recognizing its existence, showing it that it was seen, mattered. One evening, I ventured into the small attic again. The air was thick with dust, the beams low. I felt the presence immediately, heavy and deliberate. I called out softly, "Are you here?" There was a pause, then a whisper, "Margaret." The name hit me like a physical blow. Margaret Hensley, the gravestone in the cemetery. My heart raced. I asked if she needed help, and the air shifted, a soft draft moving past me, almost brushing my face. I felt her sorrow, her loneliness, and I understood. She was not malevolent. She was trapped, grieving, waiting for acknowledgement. The nights continued in a rhythm of quiet interaction. I would write, she would move things subtly or leave faint messages, and sometimes she would simply observe. I started documenting everything, noting her patterns, her responses. I came to understand her presence as protective rather than harmful. She never intended harm. Her sadness, her longing, merely sought recognition. I felt a strange kinship, a shared solitude, bridging the worlds of the living and the dead. Months passed, and the cabin became a space where the boundaries of life and death felt fluid. I learned to navigate the presence, to coexist with it. I discovered that speaking aloud, acknowledging her existence, and offering understanding diminished the fear. The once oppressive silence became companionable, filled with subtle signs of life beyond the visible. The cabin no longer felt like a place of terror, but of quiet communication, of the unspoken connection between worlds. One particularly still night, as autumn deepened, I felt her presence more strongly than ever. I was writing at the desk, the lamp casting long shadows, when a cold hand rested lightly on my shoulder. I didn't flinch. Instead, I whispered, "You're safe." The air shifted, warm and calm in contrast to the chill, and the chair in the corner, which had often rocked in solitude, moved one final time, gently back and forth, then stopped. I sensed her departure, peaceful at last. In the weeks that followed, the cabin retained the echoes of her presence, but no longer the weight of it. The sounds ceased, the subtle movements stopped, and the oppressive quiet gave way to natural silence. Yet, I never forgot. Even years later, the memory of Margaret's presence lingered. In quiet moments, especially on windy nights or when the autumn leaves rustled outside, I feel her near, a reminder that some spirits are not malevolent but simply unseen, seeking recognition and understanding from the living. I eventually moved from the cabin, returning to city life, but the experience stayed with me. I learned that fear often comes from the unknown, but acknowledgement can transform it. Margaret's presence, once terrifying, became a reminder of connection across realms. Nights alone, long after I left the cabin, I would sometimes hear a faint whisper in the mind, gentle and reassuring, and I would smile, knowing that even in absence there are echoes that persist, memories that linger, and spirits that finally find peace. Story the end. It was early October when I moved into the small farmhouse on the outskirts of Cedarville, Ohio. I had been looking for a quiet place to write, somewhere away from the chaos of the city, and this place seemed perfect. The property was isolated, surrounded by acres of cornfields that swayed in the wind, giving the house a feeling of being tucked away from the world entirely. The previous owners had moved out abruptly, leaving behind some furniture and belongings that hadn't been claimed. Margaret, the real estate agent, told me it had been empty for almost a year, and locals avoided it, saying the house had a mind of its own. I laughed it off. Ghost stories never bothered me much. They were just stories, right? The first week was peaceful. I spent my days unpacking boxes, arranging my writing space by the large window in the living room that overlooked the fields. At night, the house creaked and groaned, but I attributed it to the old wood settling. Daisy, my cat, explored every nook and corner, mostly ignoring me as she went about her nightly patrols. Then the noises started. At first, it was subtle, a faint scratching in the kitchen, footsteps in the hallway when I knew I was alone. I chalked it up to the wind, or perhaps a raccoon outside. But Daisy didn't agree. She would stiffen, ears flat, staring intently at empty corners of the room. Sometimes she hissed at the walls as if something unseen was lurking there. One night, about 2 weeks after I moved in, I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of a door creaking open. I froze. The farmhouse doors were heavy, and I had double-checked each one before bed. Daisy bolted out of the bedroom and ran toward the staircase, fur standing on end. I followed her gaze and saw a faint silhouette at the top of the stairs, shadowed by the dim moonlight streaming through the window. I couldn't see details, but the figure seemed human, small, almost frail, and it was staring at me. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, that the isolation and stress of moving had played tricks on my mind. But the next morning, I found faint footprints on the dust along the hallway floor. Small, delicate, definitely human. Daisy refused to go near them, crouching low and growling softly. The occurrences became more frequent. Objects moved from their usual places. I would wake up to find my keys on the kitchen counter instead of the hook by the door, my coffee cup in the middle of the living room floor. I started hearing humming at night, a low, almost melancholic tune that seemed to come from the hallway outside my bedroom. I would call out and it would stop, only to resume a few minutes later when I had convinced myself it had ended. I asked Margaret about the previous owners, hoping for some rational explanation. She was hesitant at first, but eventually she revealed that the family who had lived there before had left suddenly, leaving most of their belongings behind. Neighbors whispered about strange occurrences, lights turning on and off, doors opening on their own, shadows moving through the house when no one was home. Some even claimed to have seen a little girl wandering the fields at night, her face pale and her eyes hollow. One night, I woke to Daisy scratching at my bedroom door. I opened it to see her staring at the corner near the stairs, fur bristled, tail stiff. And then I saw her, standing there, barely visible in the dim light, her long hair obscuring her face, wearing a white dress that seemed to float above the floor. She didn't move or make a sound, just watched. My heart pounded, and I couldn't speak. When I finally managed to whisper, "Who are you?" she tilted her head and vanished. After that night, I couldn't sleep alone. I would sit in the living room, lights on until the sun rose. The humming continued, sometimes accompanied by faint sobbing or whispers. I began documenting everything, times, sounds, movements, hoping to find a pattern. It seemed she appeared most often between 2 and 4 in the morning, always near the stairs or the hallway outside my bedroom. I started researching local history and police records, trying to find anyone who might match the description of the girl. That's when I discovered Emma. She had lived in the farmhouse in the 1940s, a young girl who had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said she had wandered into the cornfields and never returned. Others claimed she had been locked in the basement by an abusive relative. The official reports were vague, leaving more questions than answers. Determined to help her, I began leaving notes and small offerings in the hallway, flowers, a candle, a glass of water. At first, nothing happened, but gradually the noises shifted. The footsteps became lighter, less threatening. Daisy would cautiously explore the hallway instead of staying glued to my side. The humming became less frequent, though still present, almost as if she was acknowledging my efforts. One night, I decided to speak directly to her. I sat on the stairs, holding a small candle, and whispered, "Emma, I want to help you. Can you tell me what happened?" The house was silent for a moment. Then I felt a cold breeze brush my face, and I heard a faint voice, soft and trembling. "I can't leave. I can't leave this place." I realized then that she was trapped, bound to the house by fear and unresolved pain. Over the next few weeks, I tried to communicate more, leaving messages, speaking aloud at night, and paying close attention to the responses. The subtle taps, shifts of objects, even the occasional fleeting shadow that seemed to nod when I spoke. The more I engaged, the calmer the house became. I learned she lingered around specific objects, particularly the old mirror in the hallway. I spent nights holding conversations in front of it, coaxing her to recount memories, acknowledge her fear, and eventually to release it. One night, she appeared fully in front of the mirror, eyes still dark but softer, posture relaxed. She whispered, "Thank you," and slowly faded, leaving the hallway quiet for the first time since I moved in. Months passed, and the farmhouse felt alive in a different way, peaceful rather than ominous. I could finally sleep through the night. Daisy no longer hesitated to explore. I sometimes caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, but it was gentle, almost protective. Emma's presence had shifted from trapped and sorrowful to calm and resolved. Living there taught me something profound. Not all spirits linger out of malice. Some stay because they are lost, bound by trauma, or unfinished business. They require acknowledgement, understanding, and sometimes just patience to find their way. Emma's story became part of my own life, a quiet reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and of the compassion that can bridge it. Years later, when I recount my time in that farmhouse, I do so not as a tale of terror, but as a testament to the persistence of the human spirit, living and departed alike, and the quiet ways in which they reach out for connection, understanding, and release. Story the end. I moved to a small town in rural Pennsylvania in late September. I had just accepted a new job that would require long hours at a clinic on the outskirts of town, and I needed a quiet place to live. The house I rented was an old 2-story farmhouse on the edge of a narrow country road. From the outside, it looked charming. White clapboard siding, a wraparound porch, a yard bordered by dense woods. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt the weight of decades pressing in. The floors creaked with every step. The windows rattled when the wind blew through the trees, and a faint, musty scent lingered, as though the house itself remembered everyone who had ever lived there. I brought Max, my golden retriever, with me. Normally, he adapted quickly to new places, but from the moment we stepped inside, he hesitated at the doorway, ears flat, tail low. He sniffed the air, glanced down the hallway, and then reluctantly followed me in. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just sensing something new. The first few nights were quiet, but I had trouble sleeping. The wind rattling the windows, the creak of the floors, and the isolated quiet of the property made it hard to relax. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rustle of the trees, and Max would rest his head on my chest, ears twitching at every sound. On the third night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a sound I couldn't identify at first. It was soft, almost like whispering, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. Max bolted upright, hackles raised, low growl vibrating in his chest. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, that I was still half asleep. But the whispering continued, soft and pleading, unintelligible but real. My heart pounded as I reached for the baseball bat under my bed. "Hello?" I called out, voice shaking. Silence followed, then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving down the hall. Max growled, pacing along the edge of the bed, refusing to stay in place. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door, then resumed, fading as they moved away. I lay awake the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I found a few things out of place. A chair in the living room had been shifted slightly, a blanket folded differently. Nothing major, but enough to make me uneasy. I began keeping a notebook by my bed, writing down every odd occurrence, objects moved, footsteps, the feeling of being watched, Max's unusual behavior. Over the next week, the activity increased. I would wake to find doors open that I had closed, books misplaced, and sometimes I would hear the soft murmur of voices, though no one was there. Max refused to go upstairs, sitting at the bottom of the stairs, growling at shadows that didn't exist. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses settle, drafts move things, dogs can be skittish. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One evening, a neighbor came by to introduce herself. I asked casually about the history of the house, and she hesitated, then told me that people who lived there before often complained of strange occurrences. She mentioned a young woman who had died in the upstairs bedroom years ago, under circumstances that were never fully explained. "Some say she's still here," the neighbor said quietly. "She doesn't mean anyone harm, but she lingers." I nodded, not wanting to seem too freaked out, but my stomach tightened. The nights became worse. I would wake to the sound of running water when no faucet was on, objects moving in the living room, and shadows that seemed heavier than they should have been. One night, I awoke to the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. I froze, listening as footsteps echoed down the hallway. Max barked, panicked, and I stayed frozen, clutching the bat until the first light of dawn. One particularly stormy night, the events escalated. Rain pounded against the roof, wind rattled the windows, and the power went out. I lit candles, trying to calm myself, but the house felt alive in a way I couldn't describe. The whispers returned, louder, urgent, calling my name. I held Max close, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Then I heard footsteps coming from the upstairs hallway. Slow at first, then faster, almost frantic. I grabbed the flashlight and went to investigate. At the end of the hallway, I saw her, the woman in a long, tattered dress, pale, hair floating as though underwater. She didn't approach, just stood there watching. A deep sadness emanated from her, so strong it made me dizzy. I whispered softly, "I mean no harm. I just want to live here in peace." The figure didn't move, but the footsteps stopped and the whispers faded. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay. I began packing quietly, taking care not to disturb anything that might draw attention. Max stayed close, alert, growling occasionally at empty corners. I left the house at dawn, never looking back. Even months later, I sometimes hear soft whispers in my apartment or catch movement in the corner of my eye. I tell myself it's my imagination, a residue of living in that old house. But late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I can feel her presence, patient, sorrowful, and waiting in that old farmhouse at the edge of the woods. Story, the end.